Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Man Behind the Mask. Jonathan Stone stood in his study, watching the rain streak down bulletproof windows that cost more than most people's cars. At 42, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had stared death in the face and walked away laughing. His weathered hands, scarred from countless missions with Delta Force, now held a crystal tumbler of whiskey worth more than some annual salaries. The transition from special operations to private military contracting had been seamless. Stone Strategic Solutions wasn't just another PMC. It was the PMC that governments called when they needed problems to disappear without questions. Jonathan had built an empire on discretion, precision, and an unforgiving code. Loyalty was everything, and betrayal meant death. "Dad, you promised we'd throw the football today," came a voice from the doorway. Matt Stone, his 12-year-old son, stood there in a Yankees jersey, hope flickering in his eyes that mirrored Jonathan's own steel-gray stare. "Weather's not cooperating, son," Jonathan replied, setting down his glass. "How about we hit the indoor range instead? Time you learn to handle something bigger than that .22. Matt's face lit up. Despite the divorce proceedings with Adrian, Jonathan had fought tooth and nail for joint custody. The boy was everything to him, the one pure thing in a world stained with blood and politics. "Is Mom coming to dinner tonight?" Matt asked, his excitement dimming slightly. Jonathan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Adrian Stone, née Hartman, had been his anchor once. A former State Department analyst, she'd understood the demands of his work, the long deployments, the classified nature of his operations. They'd met at an embassy function in Baghdad. Her brilliant mind and stunning beauty had captivated him instantly. But somewhere along the line, understanding had turned to resentment. The late nights, the sudden disappearances, the blood that sometimes stained his clothes despite his best efforts to leave work at work. It had all become too much for her. Or so she claimed. "She's busy tonight," Jonathan said carefully. He'd noticed the changes months ago. The new perfume, the way she guarded her phone, the sudden interest in yoga classes that ran suspiciously late. A man didn't survive 2 decades in special operations by ignoring his instincts. As if summoned by their conversation, Adrienne's BMW pulled into the circular drive. Even at 38, she moved with practiced grace, her auburn hair perfectly styled, her business suit tailored to perfection. She'd maintained the facade of the devoted wife beautifully, right up until she hadn't. "Jonathan," she said, entering through the front door with the confidence of someone who still belonged there. "I need to discuss something with you." Matt bounded toward her as she embraced him with genuine warmth. Whatever else Adrian was, she loved their son. That was the one thing Jonathan still respected about her. "Matt, why don't you go get your gear ready for the range?" Jonathan suggested. "Your mother and I need to talk." Once the boy was out of earshot, Adrienne's demeanor shifted. Gone was the loving mother, replaced by the calculating woman who'd once analyzed enemy intelligence for the government. "I want to accelerate the divorce proceedings," she said without preamble. "And I want primary custody of Matt." Jonathan's expression didn't change, but something cold settled in his chest. "Is that so? You're never here, Jonathan. Your work. My work pays for this house, your car, your lifestyle," he interrupted quietly. "My work kept this family safe while you complained about lonely nights." "That's exactly what I'm talking about. You can't separate Jonathan the father from Jonathan the killer." The word hung in the air between them like a blade. Jonathan stepped closer, and despite herself, Adrian took a step back. There was something in his eyes that reminded her why enemy combatants had nightmares about men like her husband. "Choose your words carefully, Adrian, for all our sakes." She lifted her chin defiantly. "I've already spoken to my lawyer. I have documentation of your extended absences. The court will see that Matt needs stability." "Documentation," Jonathan repeated slowly. "How thorough of you." What she didn't know was that Jonathan had documentation of his own. Surveillance footage from the Marriott downtown. Credit card receipts from restaurants where she claimed to be at work. And most damning of all, photographs of her with Rick Kaplan, the slick financial advisor who'd been sniffing around wealthy, divorcing women like a shark scenting blood. But Jonathan Stone didn't reveal his cards until he was ready to play them. And he was far from ready. "We'll discuss this after Matt goes to bed," he said finally. "Family dinner first." Adrian nodded, but something in his tone made her uneasy. She'd forgotten that beneath the expensive suits and corporate facade, she'd married a predator. And predators didn't forgive. They waited. Chapter 2. Cracks in the Foundation. The family dinner was a masterclass in controlled tension. Jonathan carved the roast with surgical precision while Matt chattered about school and baseball tryouts. Adrian pushed food around her plate, stealing glances at her phone when she thought Jonathan wasn't looking. He noticed everything. The new manicure, fire engine red instead of her usual conservative pink. The subtle change in her makeup routine. The way she touched her collarbone when nervous, a tell he'd cataloged years ago during their early relationship. "So, Matt," Jonathan said, cutting into the silence, "your mother thinks you need more stability." The boy looked confused. "What do you mean?" "She thinks I'm not around enough. That my work makes me a bad father." "That's not what I said," Adrian interjected sharply. "Isn't it?" Jonathan's voice remained level, but his eyes were ice. "You want primary custody because I'm, quote, never here, unquote." Matt's face fell. At 12, he was old enough to understand that his parents' marriage was crumbling, but young enough to blame himself. "Is it because I asked you to miss that deployment last Christmas?" "No, son," Jonathan said firmly, reaching across to squeeze the boy's shoulder. "This has nothing to do with you. Sometimes adults make choices that hurt the people they're supposed to protect." The double meaning wasn't lost on Adrian. Her cheeks flushed, but she held her tongue. For now, after Matt went upstairs to finish homework, the real conversation began. 22 years, Jonathan said, pouring himself another whiskey. He didn't offer one to Adrian. She'd switched to wine months ago, specifically a 2018 Chateau Margaux that Rick Kaplan had recommended. Another detail she thought he hadn't noticed. "What? 22 years since we met in Baghdad. 15 married. One beautiful son. And this is how you want to end? With lawyers and accusations." Adrienne's facade cracked slightly. "You changed, Jonathan. The man I married." "The man you married was a killer then, too," he said quietly. "The only thing that changed was your willingness to pretend otherwise." She stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, motion sensors had activated the perimeter lighting, illuminating the manicure grounds. Even in civilian life, Jonathan maintained operational security that would make the Pentagon jealous. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered. "The wondering if you're coming home. The blood. God, Jonathan, sometimes I wake up and you're having nightmares, talking about targets and extraction points. Do you have any idea what that's like?" For a moment, Jonathan felt something that might have been sympathy. The life of a spec ops spouse was brutal in ways civilians couldn't understand. But then he remembered the photographs tucked away in his safe. The lies. The betrayal. "So you found comfort elsewhere," he said. Adrian went very still. "What are you talking about?" "Rick Kaplan. Financial advisor. Divorced twice. No kids. Drives a leased Porsche and wears cologne that costs more than most people's rent." Jonathan took a sip of whiskey. "Nice choice. Very predictable." The color drained from Adrienne's face. "I don't know what you think you. I think I know exactly what I know," Jonathan interrupted. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" For 15 years, Adrian had been married to a man who specialized in extracting information from people who didn't want to give it. She should have known better than to try lying to him. "It's not what you think," she said weakly. "It never is." Jonathan stood, moving with that predatory grace that had once made her heart race and now made her blood chill. "But here's what I think, Adrian. I think you've been planning this for months. I think Rick saw an opportunity. Wealthy woman in an unhappy marriage, husband with a dangerous job who might conveniently disappear permanently someday. You're paranoid. I'm experienced. And experience tells me that Rick isn't just interested in your body. He's interested in my money. Our money. Matt's inheritance." The accusation hung between them like a loaded weapon. Adrienne's hand trembled as she reached for her wine glass. You're wrong. Am I? Then prove it. Tell Rick you're staying with your husband. Call off the lawyers. We'll work through our problems like adults. Adrienne's silence was answer enough. Jonathan nodded slowly, as if she confirmed something he'd already known. I want you to understand something, Adrienne. I've killed men for threatening my family. I've toppled governments for endangering American interests. I've made warlords disappear for touching things that didn't belong to them. He stepped closer, and she could smell his cologne, the same scent she'd fallen in love with years ago, now tinged with something darker. What do you think I'll do to people who try to take my son from me? The threat was delivered so quietly, so calmly, that it took Adrienne's breath away. This wasn't the man she'd married. This was the man who'd earned his reputation in places where mercy was a liability. Are you threatening me? I'm educating you. Jonathan finished his whiskey and set the glass down with deliberate care. You want a divorce? Fine, but you'll play by my rules, or you'll discover why my enemies don't stay enemies for very long. Adrienne grabbed her purse with shaking hands. I'm staying at a hotel tonight. Give Rick my regards, Jonathan called after her. As her BMW disappeared down the drive, Jonathan pulled out his phone and dialed a secure number. Kurt, it's Jonathan. I need a full workup on Rick Kaplan. Yeah, the whole package. Financial, personal, criminal, everything. No, it's not business this time. It's personal. He hung up and stared out of the night. 22 years of marriage, and it had come to this. But if Adrienne thought he'd simply roll over and let her destroy their family for a quick thrill with a smooth-talking opportunist, she'd forgotten who she was dealing with. Jonathan Stone had never lost a war. He wasn't about to start now. Chapter 3, The Art of War. The intelligence package on Rick Kaplan arrived within 48 hours, delivered by Kurt Garrett himself. Former Army Ranger, current head of security for Stone Strategic Solutions, Kurt was one of the few men Jonathan trusted completely. They'd served together, bled together, and survived impossible odds together. This guy's a real piece of work, Kurt said, dropping a thick folder on Jonathan's desk. 3 marriages, all to wealthy women. Each divorce netted him a substantial settlement. Classic predatory pattern. Jonathan flipped through the photographs and documents. Rick Kaplan at 36 was undeniably handsome in that artificial way that required significant investment. Capped teeth, subtle plastic surgery, a fitness regimen maintained more for appearance than function. He drove the leased Porsche, lived in an upscale apartment he couldn't quite afford, and had accumulated debts that would cripple most people. Financial situation? Jonathan asked. Hemorrhaging money. The lifestyle costs more than he brings in legitimately. He's been borrowing against future commissions, taking advances from wealthy clients. Kurt pointed to a highlighted section. 3 of his former clients filed complaints with the state regulatory board. Suspicious investment advice that coincidentally required them to liquidate assets he could access. Criminal activity? Nothing prosecutable yet, but the pattern's clear. He identifies wealthy women in vulnerable situations, romances them, gains access to their finances, then orchestrates divorces that leave them grateful for his support. Kurt's expression was grim. Your wife isn't his first military spouse, boss. He targeted a Navy SEAL's wife 2 years ago. Commander lost everything in the divorce, including his kids. Jonathan's hands stilled on the papers. The idea of losing Matt sent something cold and violent crawling through his chest. Where's the SEAL now? Patrick Morrison killed himself 6 months after the custody ruling. The room fell silent except for the ticking of Jonathan's grandfather clock. 2 good men, Jonathan and Patrick, who'd served their country with distinction, both targeted by the same parasite. The difference was that Patrick Morrison had played by the rules. Jonathan Stone was about to break every rule there was. Anything else I should know? Kurt hesitated. There's something unusual about this case. Kaplan usually works alone, but surveillance indicates he's been meeting with someone else. We haven't identified the contact yet, but it's not his usual MO. That was interesting. Jonathan filed the information away for later consideration. What's his current status with Adrienne? She's been staying at the Marriott downtown, for 3 days. Room 1247. Kaplan's been visiting regularly, always entering through the parking garage to avoid lobby cameras. Kurt pulled out a tablet showing surveillance footage. He's gotten careless. Arrogant, maybe. Jonathan studied the footage of his wife embracing another man, even expecting it. Seeing the betrayal on screen sent rage coursing through his veins. But he'd learned long ago to channel anger into precision rather than let it control him. I want full surveillance on both of them, he said. Audio, video, communications. I want to know what they're planning. Already in place. Wayne Santiago's handling electronic intercepts. Wes Matthews has physical surveillance. Jonathan nodded. His core team, all former special operations, all absolutely loyal. They'd followed him from government service to private contracting, and they'd follow him into hell if he asked. There's one more thing, Kurt said quietly. Matt called my wife yesterday. Kid's pretty torn up about his parents splitting. Asked if there was anything he could do to fix things. The news hit Jonathan harder than he'd expected. His son, try and solve adult problems with a child's innocence. It reinforced his resolve. Whatever else happened, Matt would be protected, even if it meant destroying everyone who threatened him. Set up a meeting with Adrian, Jonathan said. Neutral ground. Tell her I want to discuss terms. Boss, are you sure that's wise? Given what we know about Kaplan's history. I'm sure. Jonathan's voice carried the tone that had once commanded men in combat. But have the team ready. Something tells me this is about to get complicated. That evening, Matt was unusually quiet during dinner. They ate takeout Chinese food in the kitchen, the formal dining room feeling too empty without Adrienne's presence, however strained that presence had become. Dad, Matt said finally, picking at his lo mein. Yes, son? Are you and Mom getting divorced because of me? Jonathan set down his chopsticks and gave Matt his full attention. Why would you think that? Because you guys never fight about anything except stuff that has to do with me. Like when you missed my baseball game for that mission, or when Mom wanted me to go to that fancy private school and you said no. Out of the mouths of babes. Matt had identified something Jonathan had missed. Their marriage had fractured around their son, with each parent pulling in different directions. But that didn't make the boy responsible for Adrienne's betrayal. Matt, look at me. Jonathan waited until his son's eyes met his. Your mother and I are having problems because adults sometimes make bad choices. This has nothing to do with you being born or anything you've done or failed to do. You understand me. But if I was different, if you were different, I wouldn't love you as much as I do. Jonathan reached across and ruffled Matt's hair. You're the best thing your mother and I ever created together. No matter what happens between us, that will never change. Matt nodded, but Jonathan could see the boy wasn't entirely convinced. Kids always blamed themselves when their world fell apart. It was one more sin to lay at Rick Kaplan's feet. Later that night, after Matt was asleep, Jonathan reviewed the surveillance reports. Kaplan and Adrian were meeting with increasing frequency, and their conversations were becoming bolder. Audio intercepts revealed discussions about asset division, custody strategies, and something else that made Jonathan's blood run cold. Insurance policies. Specifically, the substantial life insurance policy Jonathan carried through his PMC work. The kind of policy that would leave Adrian and Matt very wealthy if something unfortunate happened to him in the field. Jonathan poured himself 3 fingers of bourbon and stared at the transcripts. Patrick Morrison hadn't just lost his family. He'd been driven to suicide by a man who profited for broken lives. And now that same predator was circling Jonathan's family, with Jonathan himself potentially in the crosshairs. But Patrick Morrison had been a good man who trusted the system to protect him. Jonathan Stone was something different entirely. He was a weapon that governments pointed at problems they needed to disappear. Time to remind everyone exactly what that meant. Chapter 4. Reconnaissance and Revelation. The meeting with Adrian was scheduled for noon at a coffee shop downtown. Neutral territory where neither could make a scene. Jonathan arrived 15 minutes early, selecting a table with clear sight lines to all entrances and exits. Old habits from a lifetime of dangerous meetings. Adrian appeared exactly on time, her punctuality a remnant of their military life together. She looked tired, Jonathan noticed. The affair was taking its toll, though whether from guilt or the stress of deception, he couldn't tell. "Thank you for agreeing to talk," she said, settling into the chair across from him. "I'm told you want to accelerate our divorce proceedings," Jonathan replied without preamble. "I'm curious about the rush." Adrienne's jaw tightened. "I think a clean break will be better for everyone, especially Matt." Interesting timing. Just when you found someone new to occupy your attention. "This isn't about Rick, isn't it?" Jonathan leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to that conversational tone that had once made terrorists reconsider their life choices. "Because from where I sit, it looks exactly like it's about Rick. Rick Kaplan, twice divorced, currently drowning in debt, with a history of targeting vulnerable women in failing marriages." The color drained from Adrienne's face. "You had him investigated." "I investigate everyone who gets close to my family." Occupational hazard. Jonathan signaled the waitress for coffee, acting as though he'd just discussed the weather. "Did you know about Patricia Morrison? Navy wife, divorced her SEAL husband with Rick's help. Her ex-husband ate his service pistol 6 months later." "You're lying." "Patricia kept the house, the kids, and a substantial alimony settlement. Rick married her 8 months after the divorce was finalized." Jonathan accepted his coffee with a nod of thanks to the waitress. The marriage lasted 18 months. Patricia's now living in a 1-bedroom apartment in Tucson, working double shifts at a call center. Adrienne's hand trembled as she reached for her water glass. Rick wouldn't what? Seduce a lonely military wife? Convince her that her husband was the problem? Help her hire lawyers who specialized in bleeding men dry? Which part seems out of character based on what you know about him? The silence stretched between them, filled with the ambient noise of the coffee shop and the weight of 18 years of shared history crumbling in real time. "I love him," Adrienne said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, you don't." Jonathan's response was matter-of-fact, almost gentle. "You love the idea of him, the attention he pays you, the way he makes you feel desired after years of feeling neglected. But love? You don't know him well enough for love. And what would you know about love?" The question came out sharper than she'd intended, years of resentment bleeding through. "When was the last time you told me you loved me? When was the last time you looked at me like I mattered more than your next mission?" The accusation hung in the air, and for a moment, Jonathan felt something crack inside his chest. Because she wasn't wrong. Somewhere between Baghdad and Kandahar, between black ops and corporate contracts, he'd forgotten how to be a husband. He'd become so focused on providing for and protecting his family that he'd forgotten to actually love them. 3 primary targets, Jonathan said, studying the building layout. Rick Kaplan, armed and considered extremely dangerous. Adrienne Stone, status unknown but possibly coerced. Matt Stone, 12 years old, priority 1 for extraction. Rules of engagement? Wayne asked, checking his rifle scope. Jonathan's expression went cold. "Anyone who threatens my son dies. Anyone who helps them dies. Anyone who gets between me and my family dies." He looked each of his men in the eye. "This is not a rescue mission. This is an execution." The warehouse sat in a neighborhood that had seen better decades. Industrial buildings in various stages of decay, separated by weedy lots and cracked parking areas. Perfect for someone who wanted privacy for illegal activities. Jonathan approached from the south, using abandoned machinery and rusted containers for cover. His team had fanned out to surrounding positions, ready to provide overwatch and cut off any escape routes. The night vision goggles turned the darkness into a green-tinted landscape where every shadow could hide death. His earpiece crackled softly. Overwatch in position. 2 vehicles visible. Adrienne's BMW and an unknown sedan. Thermal shows 4 heat signatures in the main building. 4 signatures. That meant Rick had backup. A complication, but not an unexpected one. Jonathan adjusted his approach, moving with the fluid grace of a predator closing on its prey. The warehouse loading dock had been forced open, the corrugated metal door hanging at an angle that screamed amateur hour. Jonathan slipped through the gap and into the building's interior, his weapon ready. The space was vast and mostly empty, broken only by support columns and scattered debris. Industrial lighting cast harsh shadows that would have hidden a dozen men, but Jonathan's enhanced vision revealed the truth. Rick Kaplan stood in the center of the space, obviously nervous despite his confident phone manner. Two other men flanked him, hired muscle who looked more comfortable shaking down debtors than facing military-trained opposition. And there, near the back wall, were Adrian and Matt. His wife sat zip-tied to a metal chair, her face bruised but her eyes alert. Matt knelt beside her, similarly restrained, but Jonathan could see the boy scanning for opportunities. Good. The kid had been paying attention during their camping trips and self-defense lessons. Jonathan, Rick's voice echoed in the empty space. I know you're here. Come out where we can see you, or this gets unpleasant quickly. Instead of responding, Jonathan activated his throat mic, package located. Two unknown hostiles in addition to primary target. Request immediate support. Negative, Kurt's voice replied. Let it play out. We have Overwatch. Jonathan understood. His team was in position, but they were letting him take the lead, partly because he'd ordered it, partly because they knew this had become personal in a way that transcended tactics and strategy. He stepped into the light, his hands visible, but his stance ready for violence. I'm here, Rick. Let them go. Rick Kaplan was smaller in person than he'd appeared in the surveillance photos, with the soft look of a man who relied on manipulation rather than strength. But his eyes held a cunning that Jonathan recognized, the look of a predator who'd survived by being smarter and more ruthless than his prey. The transfers first, Rick said, producing a tablet computer. 10 million to start, with the rest to follow once I confirm the funds are available. That's a lot of money for a small-time con artist. Rick's smile was cold. I'm expanding my operation. Your wife was very helpful in understanding the scope of your assets. Jonathan's gaze shifted to Adrian, whose eyes were filled with shame and terror in equal measure. Whatever she'd gotten herself into, she was clearly in over her head. The boy goes free first, Jonathan said. Then we can discuss terms. The boy goes free when I have my money. And when you're dead. The admission hung in the air like a death sentence. Rick had just confirmed what Jonathan had suspected. This wasn't about divorce settlements or custody battles. This was about elimination, pure and simple. My wife's new boyfriend held a gun to my son's head. Jonathan would remember later. Said I had 10 seconds to transfer my entire fortune. I heard my son's quiet sobbing. I can't do it that fast. I yelled. He smiled. Then he dies slowly. My wife nodded. The sight of Adrian nodding, confirming her participation in the plan, sent something savage and final through Jonathan's chest. Whatever love had existed between them died in that moment, replaced by the cold certainty of a man who'd just identified his enemies. I dropped the phone. Fine, you win. The transfer is sent. But even as Jonathan began the theatrical process of transferring funds, his real preparation was already complete. This wasn't negotiation. It was the final phase of a trap that had been months in the making. He pulled my son close, laughing. My son bit his hand, he shouted. Dad now. The boy had been listening, watching, waiting for his moment just as Jonathan had taught him. The distraction lasted only seconds, but for men trained in violence, seconds were lifetimes. Then the windows exploded as my old Delta team stormed the room. Then a dozen red dots appeared on their bodies. But that was still to come. First, Jonathan had to set the stage for the kind of justice that courts couldn't deliver. Chapter 6, The Reckoning begins. The warehouse fell silent, except for Matt's quiet sobbing and the distant hum of industrial ventilation. Rick Kaplan stood with his gun trained on the boy, confident in his position, but clearly nervous about Jonathan's calm demeanor. You're taking this very well for a man about to lose everything, Rick observed, tablet computer balanced in his free hand. I've been in worse situations, Jonathan replied matter-of-factly. Usually turns out the people pointing guns at me haven't thought their plan through completely. My plan is fine. Money transferred. You disappear. Adrian becomes a grieving widow with a very substantial inheritance. Rick's smile was predatory. She'll need comforting, naturally. Jonathan glanced at his wife, whose face had gone ashen at Rick's casual mention of murder. Still think this is about love, Adrian? I never wanted, she began. She never wanted you dead, Rick interrupted. Initially, but people change their minds when they understand the stakes. He gestured with the gun toward Jonathan. Your husband has made a lot of enemies over the years. Cartel leaders, terrorist commanders, government officials who discovered their corruption have been exposed. Any one of them would pay handsomely to know where to find Jonathan Stone. The pieces clicked into place with crystalline clarity. This wasn't just about divorce money or insurance payouts. Rick had been gathering intelligence on Jonathan's operations, his enemies, his vulnerabilities. He was planning to sell that information to the highest bidder, with Jonathan's death as proof of good faith. How much? Jonathan asked. Excuse me? But that didn't excuse betrayal. And it sure as hell didn't excuse putting Matt at risk. You're right, he said quietly. I failed as a husband. I let my work consume me, and I took you for granted. But instead of talking to me about it, you decided to fuck a con artist. Adrian flinched at the crude language. Jonathan rarely swore around her, and never in public. And now, he continued, that con artist is pushing you to accelerate our divorce so he can get his hands on my assets faster. Tell me, Adrian, has he mentioned my life insurance policy yet? This time, she couldn't hide her shock. Her eyes widened, and her breath caught in a way that confirmed Jonathan's worst suspicions. How did I what? How did I know that your boyfriend has been researching the payout on my death benefits? How did I know he's been asking questions about my upcoming deployment to Somalia? Jonathan's voice remained calm, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. Did you really think I wouldn't notice someone plotting my murder? It's not like that, Adrian whispered, but her protest lacked conviction. Then what is it like? Explain to me how discussing my life insurance with your lover is somehow innocent. The coffee shop suddenly felt too small, too public for this conversation. Other patrons were beginning to stare, sensing the tension radiating from their table. We should go somewhere more private, Adrian said. No. Jonathan's tone brooked no argument. We're finishing this here, where there are witnesses. Tell me about the insurance policy, Adrian. Tell me about the deployment schedule Rick's been so interested in. When she didn't respond, Jonathan pulled out his phone and played an audio file. Rick's voice, clear and confident, filled the space between them. The policy pays out double for death in combat zones. 3 million becomes 6 million if something happens during the Somalia operation. All we need to do is make sure the divorce isn't finalized before he deploys. Adrienne's face went white as the recording continued. These PMC guys have dangerous jobs, babe. Accidents happen all the time, especially to men who've made enemies around the world. Jonathan stopped the playback and put his phone away. Still think this is about love? Tears were streaming down Adrienne's face now, a mixture of shame and terror. She'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and they both knew it. I never wanted you to get hurt, she whispered. Rick said, he said you had so many enemies that someone would eventually kill me, and you might as well profit from it, Jonathan finished. Very practical, very romantic. He stood, throwing a 20 on the table to cover their untouched drinks. Here's what's going to happen, Adrian. You're going to end things with Rick. Today. Then you're going to come home, and we're going to tell Matt that Mommy and Daddy work things out. I can't do that. You can, and you will. Because the alternative is that I start treating Rick Kaplan like the hostile combatant he is. Jonathan leaned down, his voice dropping to a whisper that only she could hear. You've forgotten what I do for a living, but I haven't. And I've never failed to eliminate a threat to my family. As he walked away, Adrian sat frozen at the table, understanding for the first time that she hadn't just betrayed her husband. She declared war on one of the most dangerous men alive. And wars with Jonathan Stone had only one possible outcome. Chapter 5. The Trap Springs. 3 days passed before Rick Kaplan made his move. Jonathan had expected subtlety, a gradual escalation, careful planning. Instead, Rick displayed the arrogance of a man who'd succeeded too many times against unprepared opponents. The call came at 2:17 a.m., jarring Jonathan from the light sleep of a professional who'd learned to wake alert and ready. Matt's panicked voice cut through the fog instantly. "Dad, Dad, help me." Then a different voice, smooth and confident. "Hello, Jonathan. I believe we have something to discuss." Jonathan was out of bed and reaching for the secure phone before Rick finished speaking. Speed dial connected him to Kurt Garrett, whose voice came through clear and alert. The man slept like a soldier, ready for action at a moment's notice. "Primary package is compromised," Jonathan said, using the code they'd established for Matt. "Execute Overwatch." "Copy." 3 minutes out. Jonathan was already pulling on tactical gear, his movements precise and automatic. The Sig Sauer went into its shoulder holster, extra magazines into vest pockets, ceramic trauma plates locked into place. This wasn't the business attire of a corporate executive. This was the combat rig of a man preparing for war. "You're very calm for a man whose son is in mortal danger." Rick's voice continued through the phone, now confident he had Jonathan's full attention. "Where are you?" Jonathan's voice was steady, but anyone who knew him would have recognized the tone. It was the same voice he'd used when calling in airstrikes on enemy positions. "The Warehouse District, 1247 Industrial Way." Fitting address, don't you think? Same as Adrienne's hotel room number. Rick chuckled at his own cleverness. "She's here too, by the way." Surprisingly cooperative once I explained the situation. Jonathan was moving through the house now, grabbing additional equipment from hidden caches. Night vision goggles, tactical radio, the specialized gear he'd hoped never to need in civilian life. "What do you want, Kaplan?" "Well, I've always wanted your money. All of it. Transferred to accounts I'll provide, along with signed documents granting Adrian immediate custody and all assets. And if I refuse, then your son learns what his father's enemies do to the families of men like you." Rick's voice hardened. "I've done my research, Jonathan. You've killed a lot of people over the years, made a lot of enemies. It would be tragically ironic if your past finally caught up with your family." Through his bedroom window, Jonathan could see the first of his security team arriving. Kurt's SUV, followed by Wayne Santiago's motorcycle and Wes Matthews in the communications van. His people, ready to follow him into hell. "I'll need time to arrange the transfers," Jonathan said, buying time while his team got into position. "You have 1 hour. And, Jonathan, come alone. Any sign of backup, any indication you're not taking this seriously, and Matt pays the price." The line went dead. Jonathan stared at the phone for exactly 3 seconds, then swept out of the house to meet his team. The tactical briefing took 2 minutes. Warehouse district, minimal civilian presence, industrial buildings providing multiple approaches and firing positions. Kurt had already pulled up satellite imagery on his tablet, marking entry points and potential sniper nests. "How much did they offer you?" "For my location, my security protocols, my family's whereabouts." Jonathan's voice remained conversational, but something in his tone made Rick take a half step backward. "Because I'm curious what my life is worth on the international market these days." Rick recovered his composure quickly, enough to make this little domestic drama very profitable. "The Medellin cartel alone offered $5 million for confirmed intel on your whereabouts. Apparently, you cost them a significant operation in Colombia." "Actually, I cost them $30 million in product and 24 men," Jonathan corrected. "But who's counting?" He was stalling for time while his team maneuvered into position, but he was also learning. Rick wasn't working alone. He had connections to criminal organizations that wanted Jonathan dead. This was bigger than a simple con game. "The transfers are taking longer than expected," Rick said, checking his tablet. "Maybe you need additional motivation." He nodded to one of his men, who produced a knife and moved toward Matt. The boy looked at his father with trust that was almost heartbreaking, complete confidence that Dad would fix this, that the nightmare would end. "I can't do it that fast," Jonathan yelled, putting desperation in his voice that he didn't feel. "The security protocols require multiple confirmations." Rick smiled, enjoying the apparent power he held over a man he'd clearly researched but never truly understood. "Then he dies slowly." The words were barely out of Rick's mouth when Adrian nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement that confirmed her complicity in threatening her own son. In that moment, whatever remained of Jonathan's marriage, his family, his old life, died completely. Fine, you win. The transfer is sent. Jonathan made a show of completing the financial transaction, his fingers moving across his phone with apparent defeat. But the message he was actually sending was very different. Execute Thunderbolt. All targets are hostile. No survivors. Rick pulled Matt close, laughing with the satisfaction of a man who thought he just won the lottery. Smart choice. Now your boy gets to. Matt's teeth sank into Rick's gun hand with the ferocity of a child fighting for his life. The man screamed, his grip loosening on both the weapon and the boy. Dad now, Matt shouted, rolling away from Rick's failing grip. The windows exploded inward as Jonathan's Delta Force team made their entrance. Glass and steel debris filled the air, while smoke grenades created instant concealment. But even as Kurt, Wayne, and Wes moved with lethal precision, red laser dots bloomed across their bodies. Rick's backup plan was better than Jonathan had anticipated. Snipers in the surrounding buildings, positioned to eliminate any rescue attempt. The con artist had done his research after all. Stand down, Rick shouted over the chaos, his gun now trained on Adrian instead of Matt. All of you, stand down, or Mrs. Stone dies. The warehouse fell silent except for the settling debris and everyone's heavy breathing. Jonathan's team held their positions, weapons ready, but unable to act without risking civilian casualties. Very good, Rick said, blood dripping from his bitten hand. Now we can finish this properly. But Jonathan Stone hadn't survived 2 decades of special operations by panicking when plans went sideways. As Rick repositioned his weapon and his men tried to regain control of the situation, Jonathan was already implementing a contingency that none of them could have anticipated. Because Rick Kaplan had made one crucial error in his research, he'd assumed that Jonathan's greatest weakness was his family. He hadn't considered that it might also be his greatest strength. And he certainly hadn't considered what a 12-year-old boy might do when his father's life was at stake. Chapter 7. Blood and Justice. The standoff lasted exactly 14 seconds, long enough for Rick to feel secure in his position, not long enough for him to notice Matt working his hands free from the zip ties. The boy had been listening during those camping trips when Jonathan taught him about escape and evasion, even if they both thought it was just father-son bonding time. You know what I like about family businesses? Rick said, his confidence returning as he surveyed the frozen tactical team. Everyone's so predictable. The protective father, the loyal soldiers, even the guilty mother try to redeem herself. He was wrong about Adrian, though. Jonathan could see it in her eyes. Whatever delusion she'd been living under had shattered completely. The woman who'd nodded approval for her son's death was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood the monster she'd brought into their lives. Rick, she said quietly, let Matt go. You have what you wanted. What I wanted was simple, Rick replied. Money, property, and the elimination of inconvenient complications. But your husband turned this into something much more elaborate. He gestured toward the shattered windows where red laser dots still danced across Jonathan's men. Did you know he had a standing contract with 3 different intelligence agencies? That half the terrorist organizations in the Middle East have active bounties on his head? Your husband isn't just wealthy, Adrian. He's a walking treasure map for anyone smart enough to exploit it. Jonathan remained motionless, but his mind was cataloging every detail of their situation. 5 hostile snipers based on the laser pattern. Rick and 2 gunmen in the warehouse. Adrian and Matt both within the kill zone. His team pinned down, but ready to act on his signal. Most importantly, Matt had freed one hand and was working on a second zip tie with the patience of a boy who'd learned that rushing got you killed. The beauty of it, Rick continued, is that your death doesn't have to look suspicious. You've made so many enemies that a targeted killing would surprise exactly no one. Grieving widow, traumatized child, substantial inheritance that needs careful management by a trusted financial advisor. You thought of everything, Jonathan admitted. I always do. It's why I'm still alive when smarter men are dead. That was Rick's second mistake, assuming he was the smartest person in the room. His third mistake was turning his back on a 12-year-old boy with his father's instincts and his mother's stubborn determination. Matt's freed hands moved with careful precision, not toward his own restraints, but toward the concealed tactical radio Jonathan had taught him to recognize. The emergency beacon that would signal immediate extraction to back up teams positioned throughout the city. The activation tone was barely audible, but Jonathan heard it and smiled. "What's so funny?" Rick demanded. "You said you researched my enemies," Jonathan replied. "Did you research my friends?" The question hung in the air for exactly 3 seconds before the building's power died, plunging the warehouse into complete darkness. Emergency lighting kicked in a moment later, but the brief blackout was all Jonathan needed. He moved like the weapon he'd always been, 20 years of muscle memory guiding him through the chaos. The 6-hour came up in a perfect two-handed grip, muzzle flash illuminating Rick's shocked face as 3-round center mass dropped him where he stood. Simultaneously, Jonathan's team engaged the snipers with systematic precision. Wayne Santiago had pre-positioned charges in the surrounding buildings, a precaution that seemed paranoid until it became life-saving. The explosions eliminated 4 of the 5 sniper positions in less than 10 seconds. Rick's 2 gunmen never had a chance. Kurt Garrett and Wes Matthews moved like the professionals they were, suppressed weapons, coughing quietly as they eliminated the threats with surgical accuracy. The 5th sniper, however, had maintained his position and was drawing a bead on Matt when Adrienne threw herself between the laser sight and her son. The high-powered rifle round took her in the chest, spinning her around and dropping her to the concrete floor. Jonathan's return fire was immediate and devastating. The .300 Winchester Magnum round from his backup rifle turned the distant sniper's head into mist, ending the threat permanently. Silence fell over the warehouse like a suffocating blanket. Jonathan moved immediately to Matt, who was kneeling beside his mother's still form. Blood was spreading beneath Adrienne's body, dark and final in the harsh emergency lighting. "Mom!" Matt's voice was small, confused. "Mom, wake up!" Jonathan knelt beside them, checking for vitals he knew he wouldn't find. The round had taken Adrienne through the heart. Instant death, no pain. In her final moment, she'd chosen to protect her son rather than save herself. "She's gone, Matt." The boy looked up at his father with eyes that had aged years in the span of minutes. Was she really going to let them kill you? It was the question Jonathan had been dreading, because the answer would shape how Matt remembered his mother for the rest of his life. He could lie, protect the boy from the full truth. Or he could tell him what he needed to know to survive in a world where the people you trusted could betray you. "She made mistakes," Jonathan said carefully. "Big ones. But in the end, she chose to protect you." It wasn't the whole truth, but it was enough truth for a 12-year-old boy who'd just lost his mother and nearly lost his father in the same night. Kurt appeared at Jonathan's shoulder. "Area secure. Local PD is 20 minutes out, and we've got federal contacts who can handle the scene." Jonathan nodded, still kneeling beside his wife's body. 18 years of marriage ended in violence and betrayal. But Matt was alive, and that was what mattered now. "Dad." Matt's voice was steady despite everything he'd witnessed. "What happens now?" Jonathan looked down at his son. The only family he had left, the only thing in his life that was still pure and worth protecting. "Now we make sure this never happens again." But even as he spoke the words, Jonathan knew that Rick Kaplan's death was just the beginning. The man had connections, employers, people who would want to know why their asset had suddenly gone silent. The war for his family's safety was far from over. Chapter 8: Ghosts and Consequences. The federal cleanup team arrived within an hour, transforming the warehouse into a sterile crime scene with the efficiency of people who'd done this many times before. Jonathan recognized the lead agent, Sarah Chun, CIA liaison he'd worked with during his PMC days. She surveyed the carnage with professional detachment. 5 dead, including a federal informant, she said, checking her tablet. "This is going to require some creative paperwork." "Rick Kaplan was working for you?" Jonathan asked, though he wasn't entirely surprised. The man's intelligence network had been too sophisticated for a simple con artist. Not directly. He was feeding us information about cartel financial networks in exchange for immunity on some wire fraud charges. Shin glanced toward the covered bodies. Obviously, that arrangement is now terminated. Matt sat in the back of an ambulance, being checked by paramedics despite his protests that he was fine. The boy had witnessed more violence in one night than most adults saw in a lifetime, but he seemed to be handling it with the same steady calm that had kept him alive. "What's the official story?" Jonathan asked. "Home invasion gone wrong. Mrs. Stone surprised the intruders and was killed protecting her son. You arrived with private security and eliminated the threats." Chin's expression was neutral. "The investigation will be thorough but brief, and the conclusion will be favorable to you." It was the kind of arrangement that made civilian law enforcement nervous and politicians grateful. Messy situations cleaned up with minimal public scrutiny. Jonathan had participated in enough of them to know the drill. "There's something else," Chun continued, lowering her voice. "Kaplan's hotel room contained files on 12 other military families. Detailed financial information, deployment schedules, personal vulnerabilities. You weren't his first target, and you wouldn't have been his last." The news hit Jonathan harder than he'd expected. Matt's kidnapping hadn't been random bad luck. It had been part of a systematic operation targeting military families. How many other wives have been seduced? How many other children have been threatened? Are the families being notified? They will be. But that's not your responsibility anymore. Chin studied Jonathan's face. "Unless you want it to be." The offer hung in the air between them. Jonathan understood what she was really asking. His PMC work had been lucrative but ultimately mercenary. Violence for profit, however, justified. This would be different. This would be personal. "I'll need resources," he said finally. "You'll have them. Unofficially, of course." Jonathan nodded, understanding the arrangement. The federal government couldn't officially sanction a private war against criminal organizations that targeted military families. But they could look the other way while someone with the necessary skills handled the problem independently. "There's one condition," Jonathan continued. "My son comes with me." Chin's eyebrows rose. "He's 12 years old. He's also the only family I have left, and he's already a target because of who his father is." Jonathan glanced toward Matt, who was charming the paramedics with questions about their equipment. "I can protect him better if he's with me than if he's alone in some boarding school. That's not exactly conventional." "Nothing about this situation is conventional." Chin considered for a moment, then nodded. "I'll have the documentation prepared. As far as official records are concerned, Matthew Stone died in tonight's attack. The boy with you will have a new identity and a very different future." It was a harsh solution, but Jonathan knew it was the only way to keep Matt safe. The enemies Rick had made contact with wouldn't stop with Rick's death. They'd target anyone connected to the Stone family as potential leverage or revenge. Better to let Matt Stone die tonight and raise someone else entirely. 3 hours later, Jonathan sat in his home office, surrounded by files that painted a picture of systematic predation on military families. Rick Kaplan had been sophisticated in his approach, but he'd also been meticulous in his record-keeping. Bank accounts, contact information, operational plans, everything needed to roll up his entire network. Matt appeared in the doorway, having finally escaped the paramedics and federal agents. The boy looked tired but alert, processing everything he'd seen with the same analytical mind that would have made him a good soldier someday. "Are we in danger?" he asked directly. "Yes," Jonathan replied, seeing no point in sugarcoating the truth. "The men your mother's boyfriend was working with won't be happy about losing their investment. They'll try to use us to recoup their losses. So what do we do?" Jonathan studied his son, really looked at him for the first time since the warehouse. Matt had his mother's intelligence, but his father's steady nerves. He'd survived a kidnapping and witnessed multiple deaths without falling apart. Most importantly, he'd acted decisively when it mattered most. "We disappear," Jonathan said. "Officially, you died tonight along with your mother. Unofficially, you're going to learn the family business." "Which is?" "Hunting monsters." Matt considered this for a long moment, then nodded with the seriousness of someone much older. "When do we start?" Jonathan smiled for the first time since the nightmare began. His son was definitely his father's boy. Now, but first, you need to understand something important. Jonathan leaned forward, meeting Matt's eyes. Your mother made terrible choices tonight. She betrayed our family and put you in danger. But she also died protecting you when it mattered most. I know, Matt said quietly. I heard what she said to him about letting me go. People are complicated. They can be good and bad, loyal and treacherous, sometimes in the same moment. The important thing is learning to tell the difference before it's too late. Matt nodded, absorbing the lesson. Will we ever be safe again? Safety is an illusion, Jonathan replied. But we'll be prepared, and preparation is better than safety. Over the next several hours, Jonathan began the process of erasing their old lives and building new ones. Matt Stone and Jonathan Stone died in that warehouse, victims of a home invasion that shocked their quiet suburban neighborhood. The people who emerged from the ashes were harder, more focused, and infinitely more dangerous. They had work to do. Chapter 9. The New Order. 6 months later, a man calling himself James Garrett sat in a cafe in Medellin, Colombia, reading a newspaper account of a cartel leader's mysterious death. The official story blamed rival gangs, but the locals whispered about a gringo who moved like a ghost and killed like the devil himself. Beside him, a boy who looked like he could be his son studied a chessboard with intense concentration. The kid had gotten good at chess during their travels. It helped pass the time between operations, and it taught strategic thinking in a way that would serve him well in the years ahead. Check, the boy said quietly, moving his knight to threaten his father's king. Well played. Jonathan studied the board with genuine pride. Matt had inherited more than just his father's gray eyes. The tactical mind was developing nicely too. But you missed something. Jonathan moved his bishop, creating a fork that threatened both Matt's queen and his remaining rook. Never focus so completely on attack that you ignore defense. Matt studied the new position, then smiled and tipped over his own king in concession. Another lesson learned. The most important ones usually are. They packed up the chess set and left the cafe, just another father and son traveling through South America. Nobody who saw them would guess that they'd eliminated 3 separate criminal organizations in the past 6 months, or that they were systematically dismantling the network that had once employed Rick Kaplan. Jonathan's methods were surgical and permanent. No arrests, no trials, no chances for the predators to escape justice on technicalities or plea bargains. The men and women who targeted military families simply disappeared, their organizations crumbling as key personnel vanished without explanation. Some nights, Jonathan wondered if he was becoming the monster he'd spent his career fighting. But then he'd remember the sight of his son zip-tied in that warehouse, or think about the files containing information on 12 other military families, and the doubt would fade. There were wolves in the world who preyed on the innocent. Someone had to hunt the wolves. Dad, Matt said as they walked through the crowded streets of Medellin, there's something I need to tell you. Jonathan immediately went alert, scanning for threats while keeping his voice casual. What's that? I've been thinking about Mom a lot lately. It was the first time Matt had brought up Adrienne since the night she died. Jonathan had been waiting for this conversation, dreading it and knowing it was necessary. What about her? I understand why she did what she did. With Rick, I mean. Matt's voice was steady, thoughtful. She was lonely, and he was good at making her feel special. People do stupid things when they're hurt. Jonathan nodded, surprised by his son's insight. That's very mature of you. But I also understand why you can't forgive her. Matt looked up at his father with those steel gray eyes that saw too much for someone his age. She chose him over us. Over me. And that's not something you can take back. It was a hard truth, delivered with a matter-of-fact tone that Jonathan recognized as his own. Matt was learning to see the world clearly, without the comfortable illusions that most people use to avoid difficult realities. No, Jonathan agreed. It's not. They walked in comfortable silence for several blocks, father and son united by shared experience and mutual understanding. Other kids Matt's age were playing video games and worrying about homework. Matt was learning to read behavioral patterns and memorize escape routes. Different childhoods for different worlds. The Rodriguez brothers are meeting tonight, Matt observed, nodding toward a black SUV parked outside a restaurant they've been watching for 3 days. "You're sure?" "License plate changed from yesterday, but same make and model." 3 men inside, one with the radio earpiece we've seen before. Matt recited the intelligence with professional detachment. "If we're going to move, tonight would be optimal." Jonathan felt another surge of pride mixed with sadness. His son was becoming an exceptional operator, but he was also losing pieces of his childhood every day. It was a trade-off Jonathan wasn't sure he had the right to make, but it was the hand they'd been dealt. "Tonight, it is," he agreed. "But remember the rules. Stay back, stay quiet, stay alive," Matt recited. "And if something goes wrong, you run. No matter what's happening to me, you run and you don't look back." It was the same conversation they'd had before every operation, the same promise Matt had made and broken at least 3 times when he'd provided crucial intelligence or created diversions that saved his father's life. The boy had his mother's stubborn streak, but he'd channeled it into loyalty instead of betrayal. That night, as Jonathan prepared his equipment and planned his approach, he reflected on how much their lives had changed. 6 months ago, he'd been a successful businessman with a failing marriage and a son who thought his father was just another corporate executive. Now, they were partners in a war that would probably never end, bound together by loss and purpose in equal measure. It wasn't the childhood he'd wanted for Matt, but it was the reality they inhabited. And if that reality occasionally required violence against those who preyed on the innocent, Jonathan Stone had long ago made peace with being the monster that other monsters feared. The Rodriguez brothers died that night, along with 3 of their lieutenants and the corrupt police captain who'd been providing them with protection. The official investigation would blame rival cartels, but Jonathan knew the truth would spread through the criminal underground like wildfire. There was a new player in the game, one who moved with military precision and showed no mercy to those who targeted American military families. The smart criminals would adjust their behavior. The stupid ones would try to retaliate. Jonathan hoped they were all stupid. It would make the job so much easier. As they left Medellin on a late-night flight to Guatemala City, Matt fell asleep against his father's shoulder. For a moment, watching his son sleep, Jonathan allowed himself to imagine a different life. A normal life where they could go home, where Matt could attend regular school and make friends his own age. But that life had died in a warehouse along with Adrian Stone and Rick Kaplan. This was their life now, brutal, necessary, and strangely fulfilling in its terrible clarity. Jonathan Stone had never forgiven anyone who betrayed him, and he never would. But he learned something important that night. Forgiveness was overrated. Justice was what mattered, and justice was what he and his son would deliver to anyone who threatened the innocent. One target at a time, until there were no targets left. The plane lifted off into the dark Colombian sky, carrying 2 ghosts toward their next destination and their next mission. Behind them, the criminal network that had once employed Rick Kaplan continued to crumble, its operatives disappearing one by one into the same darkness that had claimed their employers. In the intelligence community, rumors began to circulate about a father-son team that appeared wherever military families were threatened. Ghost stories, some called them. Urban legends. But the criminals knew better. They knew that monsters were real, and that sometimes the monsters hunted other monsters. And sometimes that was exactly what the world needed. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there. Welcome back to another episode of Infidelity Tales Lab. We're thankful for your continued viewership. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We love knowing our global reach. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1, The Accident. The fluorescent lights in Riverside General Hospital cast a sickly pallor over everything they touched. Robert Bobby Hutchinson stood outside room 314, his calloused hands gripping a cup of cold coffee that had long since lost any appeal. Through the small window, he could see his 17-year-old son Tommy lying motionless, tubes and wires creating a mechanical spider web around his still form. Bobby had built his construction empire from nothing, starting with a single hammer and a willingness to work 18-hour days. At 45, his weathered face told the story of every foundation he'd poured, every beam he'd raised, every rival he'd crushed to reach the top. Hutchinson Construction dominated the tri-state area, and Bobby's reputation for getting things done, by any means necessary, preceded him into every boardroom and job site. But none of that mattered now. Not with Tommy fighting for his life. Dr. Patricia Reeves emerged from the room, her expression carefully neutral. Bobby had dealt with enough people in crisis to read the signs. The slight downturn of her mouth, the way she avoided direct eye contact, the hesitation before speaking. "Mr. Hutchinson, I need to be direct with you," she began, pulling off her latex gloves. "The brain trauma from the motorcycle accident is severe. There's significant swelling, and despite our best efforts—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "There's little chance he'll wake up." "I'm sorry." The words hit Bobby like a sledgehammer to the chest, but his expression didn't change. Years of high-stakes negotiations had taught him to never show weakness, never let the other side see you bleed. "What about Linda?" Dr. Reeves asked, glancing around. "Where's your wife?" Bobby's jaw tightened imperceptibly. She had somewhere else to be. The truth was more pathetic than he cared to admit. When the hospital had called 3 hours ago, Linda had been getting ready for one of her charity galas, some fundraiser for the Arts Council that she claimed was too important to miss. Even when Bobby told her about Tommy's accident, she'd insisted she had to make an appearance first. "I'll just show my face for an hour," she'd said, applying lipstick in their bedroom mirror. "You can handle things at the hospital until I get there." Handle things. As if their son's potential death was just another construction project to manage. Bobby entered Tommy's room alone, the steady beep of monitors providing a mechanical heartbeat. He pulled a chair close to the bed and studied his son's face, so much like his own at that age, before life had hardened Bobby's features into something more intimidating than handsome. Tommy had always been different from Bobby. Where Bobby was calculating and ruthless, Tommy was idealistic and gentle. The boy read books instead of blueprints, preferred photography to power tools, and actually seemed to believe that people were fundamentally good. Bobby had worried that such naivety would get Tommy eaten alive in the real world. He'd never imagined it might literally get him killed. The motorcycle had been a compromise. Tommy's 18th birthday was next month, and he'd been begging for one for years. Linda had been against it, claiming it was too dangerous, but Bobby had seen it as a chance to teach the boy some practical skills. Now Tommy lay broken because Bobby had given in to his son's request. Reaching out, Bobby gently took Tommy's hand, careful not to disturb the 4 lines. The boy's skin was cold, and Bobby found himself rubbing Tommy's fingers, trying to warm them. That's when he felt it, something small and hard pressing against his palm from Tommy's jacket pocket. Bobby frowned and carefully reached in, pulling out a small brass key attached to a simple metal ring. Dangling from the ring was a folded piece of paper, about the size of a business card. Bobby unfolded the note with growing confusion. The handwriting was shaky, hurried, definitely Tommy's, but written in obvious distress. "Mom, use this to unlock what's inside. You need to know the truth about Derek before it's too late. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you myself. T. Derek." Bobby knew that name, though he'd only met the man twice. Derek Manning was Linda's new business partner in her interior design firm. A smooth-talking 38-year-old who'd moved to town 6 months ago and somehow convinced Linda to bring him on as co-owner of her struggling company. Bobby had never liked Derek. There was something too polished about him, too rehearsed. He spoke like a man who'd spent years perfecting the art of telling people what they wanted to hear. When Bobby had suggested running a background check, standard practice for anyone involved in Linda's business, she'd laughed it off. "He's not building skyscrapers, Bobby. He's helping me pick out curtains and paint colors." But this note suggested Tommy had discovered something about Derek that Linda didn't know. Something serious enough that a 17-year-old boy felt compelled to investigate and document it. Something that might have led to his accident. Bobby studied the key more closely. It was small, the kind used for filing cabinets, safety deposit boxes, or lockers. No identifying marks or numbers. Tommy could have hidden whatever this unlocked anywhere. The door opened, and Bobby quickly pocketed the key and note. But instead of Linda, a police officer entered. Detective Ray Morrison, a gruff man in his 50s whom Bobby recognized from various city council meetings. Mr. Hutchinson, Morrison nodded grimly. I wanted to follow up on the accident report. What's the follow-up? Tommy lost control of his bike and hit a tree. Morrison consulted his notepad. That's what it looked like initially, but the crash investigation team found something interesting. The bike's brake lines had been cut, not completely severed, but scored deep enough that they'd fail under pressure. The room seemed to tilt slightly. You're saying someone sabotaged his motorcycle? That's what the evidence suggests. We're treating this as attempted murder now. Morrison's expression softened slightly. I'm sorry, Bobby. I know this makes everything worse. Bobby's mind raced. Tommy had discovered something about Derek, something significant enough to hide evidence and leave cryptic notes. And now someone had tried to kill Tommy, possibly to keep him quiet. The pieces were starting to form a picture, and Bobby didn't like what he was seeing. Any idea who might have wanted to hurt Tommy? Morrison asked. No, Bobby lied smoothly. Everyone loved Tommy. He didn't have enemies. But Bobby was already thinking about Derek Manning, about the way the man always seemed to know just a little too much about Linda's schedule, about how he'd been pushing Linda to take on bigger projects that required her to travel more often, about how Linda had been different lately, more secretive, more defensive, more distant. Morrison left his card and promised to keep Bobby updated. Alone again with his unconscious son, Bobby pulled out the key and note, studying them by the harsh hospital lighting. Tommy had been trying to protect Linda from something. The boy had discovered Derek's true nature and had been gathering evidence. But before he could reveal the truth, someone had tried to silence him permanently. Bobby felt a familiar coldness settling into his chest, the same feeling he got when a competitor tried to undercut one of his bids or when a supplier attempted to cheat him. It was the feeling that preceded calculated, methodical destruction. Whoever had hurt Tommy had made the biggest mistake of their lives. Bobby Hutchinson had built his empire by never backing down from a fight and never forgetting those who crossed him. He'd started with nothing and crushed everyone who'd stood in his way. Now someone had touched his family, had tried to kill his son. They were going to learn why Bobby's competitors feared him, why his enemies didn't stay enemies for long, and why crossing a Hutchinson was the last mistake anyone ever made. Bobby squeezed Tommy's hand gently, then stood up. He had a key to follow and truth to uncover. And once he knew exactly who was responsible for this, he was going to make them pay in ways they'd never imagined possible. The games were over. The war had begun. Chapter 2, The Box. Bobby left the hospital at dawn, after spending the night watching Tommy's monitors and turning the mysterious key over in his hands. Linda had never shown up, texting around midnight that the charity event had run late and she'd see him in the morning. Bobby had responded with a simple okay that carried none of the volcanic rage building inside him. The Hutchinson estate sat on 40 acres outside town, a sprawling ranch house that Bobby had built with his own hands 15 years ago. As he pulled through the iron gates, he noticed Derek's black BMW wasn't in the driveway. Good. He needed time to search without interruption. Linda was in the kitchen wearing a silk robe, her perfectly styled blonde hair betraying no sign she'd been sleeping. At 41, she maintained the kind of polished beauty that required significant investment. Regular spa treatments, personal trainers, and the best cosmetic dermatologist money could buy. Bobby had been happy to pay for it all back when he believed she was worth it. How's Tommy? She asked, not looking up from her coffee cup. Alive. No change. Bobby studied her face for any hint of genuine concern. He saw none. Nice gala last night. Lovely. We raised over $200,000 for the Arts Center. She finally met his eyes. I'm sorry I couldn't get away earlier. You know how these things are. Once you're there, it's impossible to leave gracefully. Bobby nodded, filing away another lie. He'd called the Arts Center at midnight. The gala had ended at 10:30. Where's Derek this morning? How would I know? Linda's response came too quickly, too defensively. He's probably at his apartment. Another lie. Derek had bought a house on Elm Street 3 months ago. Bobby had seen the deed records when he'd started doing some quiet research on his wife's business partner. Linda knew exactly where Derek lived. "I need to shower and get back to the hospital," Bobby said. "The police want to ask me some more questions." He watched Linda's face carefully. There, just a flicker of something. Fear? Guilt? Police? Why would they need to ask you questions? Tommy's brake lines were cut. They're treating it as attempted murder now. Linda's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as she set it down. "That's impossible. Who would want to hurt Tommy?" "Good question." Bobby headed toward the stairs. "I'm sure they'll figure it out." In their bedroom, Bobby went through the motions of gathering clothes while mentally cataloging every place Tommy might have hidden whatever the key unlocked. The boy was methodical, like his father, but also sentimental. He wouldn't put important evidence somewhere completely random. It would be somewhere meaningful, somewhere safe. Bobby's eyes fell on the family portrait hanging above their dresser. Taken 2 years ago, it showed the 3 of them at their lake house, all smiling at the camera. But Bobby remembered that day differently now. Linda had been checking her phone constantly, claiming she was waiting for an important client call. Derek had been texting her frequently around that time, supposedly about business. The lake house. Tommy loved that place, had spent countless summers there fishing and reading. If he'd wanted to hide something important, somewhere his mother might think to look but Derek wouldn't know about, the lake house would be perfect. Bobby dressed quickly and headed downstairs. Linda was on the phone in her study, speaking in hushed tones. He caught fragments as he passed. "Told you this was a mistake. And need to be more careful now." She ended the call when she saw him. That was Derek. He wanted to know how Tommy was doing. Thoughtful of him. Bobby left without saying goodbye, his mind already racing ahead. The lake house was an hour drive, enough time to think through everything he knew and plan his next moves. 20 years ago, Bobby had been a different man. Young, trusting, madly in love with the beautiful receptionist at the architectural firm where he'd worked as a junior contractor. Linda had been sweet then, or at least good at pretending to be. She'd supported his dream of starting his own company, had even suggested the name Hutchinson Construction. But success had changed her. As Bobby's company grew and the money rolled in, Linda had developed expensive tastes and a social circle that looked down on Bobby's blue-collar roots. She'd started taking trips to New York for design inspiration, joining country clubs where Bobby felt like a fraud in his expensive suits, and surrounding herself with people who saw him as nothing more than a wallet with legs. Derek Manning represented everything Bobby wasn't: cultured, refined, educated at the right schools. He spoke fluent French, had studied art history in Paris, and could discuss wine and literature with the kind of casual expertise that made Bobby feel like the high school dropout he was. Bobby had built an empire, but Derek had been born into one. Old money, old family, old connections. The kind of man Linda had probably wished she'd married instead of the rough construction worker who'd gotten lucky. The lake house came into view as Bobby rounded the final curve. It was smaller than their main home, but more honest somehow. Cedar logs and native stone, built to complement the landscape rather than dominate it. Tommy had helped Bobby build the dock when he was 12, more hindrance than help, but eager to learn. Bobby parked and walked the property, thinking like Tommy would think. Where would a 17-year-old hide something important? Somewhere his parents might look, but a stranger wouldn't think to search. The old tool shed behind the house caught his eye. Bobby had built it for storing lake equipment, but Tommy had claimed half of it years ago for his photography supplies. Bobby tried the door. Locked, but with a simple padlock that looked newer than the shed itself. The brass key fit perfectly. Inside, Bobby found Tommy's photography equipment neatly arranged on makeshift shelves. But in the back corner sat a small fireproof safe, the kind used for important documents. It had an electronic lock, and scotch taped to the top was a piece of paper with a 6-digit code written in Tommy's handwriting. Bobby's hands shook slightly as he entered the numbers. The safe opened with a soft click. Inside were dozens of photographs, printed on photo paper with professional clarity. Bobby's blood turned to ice as he recognized the subjects. Linda and Derek, captured in intimate moments that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. The photos were dated, some going back nearly 8 months. Derek kissing Linda in his car. Linda leaving Derek's house early in the morning. The two of them in passionate embraces in locations Bobby recognized. Hotel lobbies, restaurant parking lots, even the back office of Linda's design firm. But the photos weren't just evidence of an affair. They told a more sinister story. Several showed Derek meeting with unfamiliar men in dark clothing. Meetings that took place in parking garages and abandoned buildings. In one series, Derek was handing over what looked like blueprints or documents. In another, he was receiving a thick envelope from a man with gang tattoos visible on his neck. At the bottom of the stack was a manila folder labeled Derek Manning Research in Tommy's careful handwriting. Inside, Bobby found printouts of news articles from Derek's previous cities: Portland, Seattle, Phoenix. A pattern emerged. Derek would arrive in a city, charm his way into partnerships with successful local businesses, and those businesses would suffer mysterious setbacks. Fires, thefts, accidents that destroyed inventory or damaged reputations. The final document made Bobby's blood run cold. It was a copy of a life insurance policy, one Bobby didn't recognize. Linda had taken out a $2 million policy on Tommy's life 6 months ago, with herself as the sole beneficiary. A handwritten note from Tommy was clipped to the policy. Found this in Mom's desk. She never told Dad. Why would she need this much insurance on me? Bobby sank into an old lawn chair, the full scope of the betrayal hitting him like a physical blow. This wasn't just an affair. Linda and Derek had been planning something bigger, something that involved Tommy's death and a massive insurance payout. Tommy had discovered their plan and been gathering evidence to expose them. But before he could reveal the truth, they tried to eliminate him permanently. The brake lines hadn't been cut by some random criminal. They'd been sabotaged by Derek on Linda's orders to silence their son and claim the insurance money. Bobby's phone buzzed with a text from Linda. "Where are you?" "Derek's coming over to discuss some business." "Thought you'd want to know." Derek was coming to the house, probably to search for any evidence Tommy might have hidden, to tie up loose ends before the police investigation got too close. Bobby carefully repacked everything in the safe, locked it, and pocketed the key. Then he pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he needed. "Marcus? It's Bobby Hutchinson. I need you and the boys to meet me at my house in an hour. Full crew. And Marcus? Bring the special tools." Marcus Rodriguez had worked for Bobby for 15 years, starting as a day laborer and working his way up to foreman. But more importantly, Marcus and his crew handled Bobby's special projects, the jobs that required discretion and absolute loyalty. Competitors who tried to sabotage Bobby's projects. Suppliers who attempted to double-cross him. City inspectors who demanded unreasonable bribes. Marcus never asked questions, never left loose ends, and never disappointed Bobby. His crew was made up of men who understood that some problems couldn't be solved through legal channels. As Bobby drove back toward town, his mind was already working through the logistics. Derek and Linda thought they were dealing with a grieving father who would be too distracted by his son's condition to notice their deception. They were about to learn that they'd gravely underestimated Bobby Hutchinson. He'd built his empire by being smarter, tougher, and more ruthless than everyone else. He'd crushed competitors who tried to destroy him, eliminated threats before they could fully develop, and never once shown mercy to those who betrayed his trust. Derek and Linda had tried to murder his son for money. They betrayed everything Bobby held sacred, violated the one rule that could never be broken: you don't touch family. Now, they were going to pay for that mistake with everything they had, everything they were, and everything they ever hoped to be. Bobby Hutchinson was done being the grieving father. It was time to remind everyone why his enemies didn't stay enemies for long. Chapter 3. The Truth Unveiled. Bobby arrived at his estate 30 minutes before Derek was scheduled to appear. Marcus and his crew were already waiting. 5 men who'd been with Bobby through every ugly situation his business had required. They sat in Marcus's van, engines running, faces hidden behind the tinted windows. Marcus stepped out as Bobby parked. At 52, he was built like a fire hydrant, short, thick, and impossible to move when he didn't want to be moved. His hands were scarred from 20 years of construction work. But Bobby knew they were equally skilled at more delicate tasks. "What's the situation, boss?" Marcus's voice carried the flat tone of a man who'd seen everything and been surprised by nothing. "My wife and her boyfriend tried to murder my son. They're coming here to clean up evidence." Bobby handed Marcus a copy of Tommy's photos. "I need them alive for questioning." After that, he shrugged. "Disposal." Marcus glanced through the photos without expression. "How long do we have?" "Derek should be here in 20 minutes. Linda's inside." "Weapons." "Derek might be armed. He's been meeting with some rough characters. Linda's probably just scared." Bobby checked his watch. "I want to talk to them first. Get the full confession on record. Then you boys can take over." The crew dispersed around the property with military precision. Bobby had learned years ago that when you needed serious problems solved, you hired serious men. Marcus's team included 2 ex-military specialists, a former police detective who'd been forced into early retirement, and a demolitions expert who officially worked removing old buildings but unofficially made problems disappear completely. Bobby entered his house through the back door. Linda was in her study, frantically going through file cabinets and desk drawers. She looked up as he entered, guilt written across her face. "You're back early," she said, trying to sound casual while shoving papers into her purse. "Looking for something specific." "Just some insurance documents." "For Tommy." The lie came easily, but her hands were shaking. Bobby leaned against the doorframe, studying the woman he'd loved for 20 years. She was still beautiful, still poised, but now he could see the calculation behind her every expression. How long had she been planning this? How many times had she looked at Tommy and seen dollar signs instead of their son? "Find what you needed?" "Not yet. The filing system in here is chaos." Linda forced a smile. "Maybe you could help me look? I'm sure Derek will be more helpful." "When's he getting here?" Linda's face went pale. "Derek? I don't think—" The front doorbell rang, cutting off her lie. Bobby smiled coldly. "Right on time." He walked to the front door, aware that Linda was following at a distance. Through the peephole, he could see Derek standing on the porch, looking casual in expensive slacks and a polo shirt. The man checked his watch, then glanced around nervously. Bobby opened the door with a welcoming smile. "Derek, what a pleasant surprise." "Bobby." Derek's handshake was firm, his smile practiced. "I heard about Tommy. Terrible thing. Linda asked me to stop by and see if there's anything I can do to help." "That's very thoughtful. Come in." Bobby led Derek into the living room, where Linda was now sitting on the couch, her purse clutched tightly in her lap. The 3 of them formed an awkward triangle, and Bobby could feel the tension radiating from his wife and her lover. "Can I get you something to drink?" Bobby asked pleasantly. "I'm fine, thanks." Derek sat down across from Linda, careful to maintain appropriate distance. "How is Tommy doing? Any improvement?" "The doctors say there's little chance he'll wake up." Bobby watched Derek's face carefully. There, just a flicker of satisfaction before the man rearranged his features into appropriate concern. "But you probably already knew that." Derek frowned. "I'm sorry. I don't understand." Bobby pulled out his phone and scrolled to the photo of Derek meeting with the tattooed man. He held it up for both of them to see. "I found Tommy's little photography project. Kid had quite an eye for capturing interesting moments." Linda gasped, her face draining of color. Derek went very still, his practice charm evaporating. "I don't know what you think that photo shows," Derek began. "I think it shows you meeting with criminals to arrange my son's murder." Bobby's voice remained conversational. "Along with about 50 other photos of you and my wife planning to cash in on Tommy's life insurance policy." Linda started to cry, real tears, but Bobby suspected they were for herself rather than Tommy. Derek, however, remained calm. "Too calm. You're upset," Derek said carefully. "Grief can make people see things that aren't there, connect dots that don't actually." 3 months ago, you convinced Linda to increase Tommy's life insurance to $2 million. 2 months ago, you started meeting with people who specialize in making accidents happen. Last week, you cut my son's brake lines. Bobby stood up slowly. "The only thing I don't understand is whether Linda came up with the plan or if you talked her into it." Derek's composure finally cracked. His hand moved toward his jacket pocket, but Bobby was ready for it. "I wouldn't," Bobby said quietly. You're surrounded. As if on cue, Marcus appeared in the doorway behind Derek, while two other crew members entered through the kitchen. Derek's hand froze halfway to his weapon. Bobby, please, Linda sobbed. You don't understand. Derek said we could be together, that we could start over somewhere new, but we needed money. Real money. And Tommy was going to college soon anyway, and the insurance was just sitting there. Just sitting there, Bobby repeated. Our son's life was just an inconvenient obstacle to your retirement plans. Derek slowly raised his hands. Look, Hutchinson, let's discuss this rationally. You're a businessman. You understand that sometimes difficult decisions have to be made for the greater good. Bobby stared at him in amazement. Even caught red-handed, Derek was trying to negotiate. The greater good? You tried to murder my son for money. Your son discovered something he shouldn't have, Derek said coldly, his mask finally slipping completely. He was going to ruin everything. We had no choice. There's always a choice. Bobby nodded to Marcus, who stepped forward and efficiently removed a pistol from Derek's jacket. You chose to be a predator. Linda chose money over family. Tommy chose to be a hero and try to save his mother from a monster. Bobby pulled out the insurance policy Tommy had found. $2 million. Is that really what you thought my son's life was worth? It was enough for us to disappear, Linda whispered. To start over somewhere Derek's past wouldn't follow him. Derek's past? Bobby looked at the man with renewed interest. You mean the 3 other cities where businesses mysteriously burned down after you became a partner? The insurance fraud investigations that always seemed to go cold right before charges were filed. Derek's eyes widened. Tommy's research had been even more thorough than Bobby had realized. The kid figured out your whole operation, Bobby continued. You target successful women with failing businesses. Promise them partnership and romance. Then arrange accidents that trigger insurance payouts before disappearing to the next city. Except this time, you decided my son was worth more dead than Linda's business was worth saving. The boy was getting too close, Derek snarled. Another few days, and he would have gone to the police. We had to act. Bobby felt the last of his restraint evaporate. For months, he'd watched Derek charm his wife, had tolerated the man's presence in his home, had even tried to like him for Linda's sake. All while Derek had been planning to murder Tommy for insurance money. Marcus, Bobby said quietly, take them to the warehouse. Keep them comfortable but secure. I need to make some arrangements. Bobby, you can't do this. Linda struggled as Marcus's men lifted her from the couch. I'm your wife. We can work this out. You stopped being my wife the moment you chose him over our son. Bobby's voice was cold as winter steel. You became a stranger who tried to murder my child for money. Derek didn't beg or plead. He just stared at Bobby with pure hatred. You think you've won something? You have no idea who you're dealing with. My associates won't let this slide. Your associates? Bobby laughed harshly. You mean the bottom feeders who cut brake lines for cash? They're going to be too busy running for their lives to worry about you. As Marcus's crew led Derek and Linda away, Bobby pulled out his phone and dialed Detective Morrison's direct number. Morrison? Bobby Hutchinson. I found out who tried to kill my son, but there's been a complication. The suspects have disappeared. I think they might be running. Yes, I'll come in first thing tomorrow to give you everything I have. After hanging up, Bobby stood alone in his living room, surrounded by the wreckage of 20 years of marriage. Photos of family vacations smiled down at him from every surface. Images of a life that had been built on lies, of a wife who'd been calculating his son's worth in dollars while posing for happy family pictures. Tomorrow, he would give the police enough evidence to trigger a massive manhunt for Derek and Linda. He would play the role of the devastated husband who discovered his wife's betrayal too late to save her from her own poor choices. But tonight, Derek and Linda would learn exactly what happened to people who tried to destroy Bobby Hutchinson's family. Bobby walked to his liquor cabinet and poured himself 3 fingers of bourbon, the good stuff he'd been saving for Tommy's 18th birthday. He raised the glass toward the family portrait above the mantel. Don't worry, son, he said quietly. Daddy's going to make this right. Outside, Marcus's van disappeared into the darkness, carrying 2 people toward a reckoning 20 years in the making. Bobby Hutchinson had built his empire by being smarter and more ruthless than everyone else. Now Derek and Linda were going to learn why his enemies didn't stay enemies for long. Chapter 4. The Reckoning Begins. Bobby spent the night at the hospital, holding Tommy's hand and planning. By dawn, he had made 17 phone calls to contacts across 3 states, each conversation brief and coded. Old favors were being called in, debts were being collected, and a network of loyal associates was mobilizing. Dr. Reeves found him in the family lounge, staring out at the parking lot where Tommy's motorcycle had been loaded onto a police trailer the day before. "Mr. Hutchinson, I wanted to update you on Tommy's condition." Bobby turned, hope and dread warring in his chest. "Any change?" "Actually, yes. The swelling in his brain has decreased slightly. It's still too early to be optimistic, but his responses to stimuli are improving." Dr. Reeves managed a cautious smile. "He's young and strong. Don't give up hope yet." For the first time in 36 hours, Bobby felt something other than rage. Tommy was fighting. His son was a survivor, just like his old man. "Can I see him?" "Of course." "And Mr. Hutchinson, I noticed your wife hasn't been by yet. Is everything all right at home?" Bobby's expression darkened. Linda had some business to take care of out of town. Emergency trip. In Tommy's room, Bobby studied his son's face for any sign of the improvement Dr. Reeves had mentioned. Tommy looked the same, pale, still attached to machines, but somehow Bobby could sense a difference. A strength that hadn't been there before. "Your mom won't be coming by anymore," Bobby said quietly, adjusting Tommy's blankets. "She made some choices that can't be undone. But don't worry about that now. You just focus on getting better." Bobby's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Packages secured. Awaiting instructions." The warehouse Marcus referenced was officially owned by a shell company that existed only on paper. Located in an industrial district 20 miles from town, it had been designed for storing equipment, but had been modified over the years for more specialized purposes. Soundproof walls, multiple exit routes, and no security cameras for miles in any direction. Bobby had used it twice before, once for a city inspector who demanded a $50,000 bribe, and once for a rival contractor who'd been sabotaging Bobby's projects. Both situations had been resolved permanently and quietly. But this was different. This was personal. Bobby squeezed Tommy's hand one more time and headed for the door. He had work to do. The warehouse sat at the end of a gravel road that wound through abandoned industrial buildings. Bobby's truck kicked up dust clouds as he approached, the morning sun casting long shadows across the empty landscape. Marcus's van was parked beside the loading dock, along with 2 other vehicles Bobby recognized. Inside, the warehouse had been divided into sections. The main floor housed legitimate construction equipment, but the back section had been converted into something more specialized. Soundproof rooms, reinforced doors, and facilities for extended stays. Marcus met Bobby at the entrance to the special section. "They're in room 3. Been asking for lawyers, making threats, the usual. Any problems bringing them in?" Manning had a backup piece strapped to his ankle. Took it off him. Linda fought like a wildcat, but she's secured now. Marcus handed Bobby a small digital recorder. "Thought you might want this for whatever comes next." Bobby pocketed the device and walked toward room 3. Through a small window, he could see Derek and Linda sitting in metal chairs, their hands zip-tied behind their backs. Linda was still crying. Derek was staring at the wall with cold fury. Bobby entered the room, followed by Marcus. Derek looked up with undisguised hatred. "This is kidnapping, Hutchinson. False imprisonment. You're looking at 20 years minimum." "Am I?" Bobby pulled up a third chair and sat down facing them. "Because according to Detective Morrison, you and Linda fled town after learning about the brake line investigation. Guilty parties running from justice. Very suspicious behavior." Linda looked up sharply. "You told the police we ran?" "I told them the truth. That when I confronted you about the insurance policy and Derek's criminal background, you both disappeared." Bobby turned on the digital recorder and placed it on a nearby table. "Now I need you to tell me the rest of the truth. Starting with when you first decided my son was worth more dead than alive." Derek leaned back in his chair. "You want a confession? Here's your confession. Your son was a naive boy who stuck his nose where it didn't belong. Your wife was a lonely woman married to a man who cared more about concrete and steel than human relationships. I simply provided what you couldn't. And what was that? Attention, affection, a future that didn't involve being married to a glorified construction worker for the rest of her life. Bobby felt Marcus tense behind him, but he kept his own voice level. So you convinced her to kill Tommy. I convinced her that sometimes sacrifices have to be made for the greater good. Derek's smile was cold. Linda understood that Tommy's inheritance would be tied up in trusts and legal complications for years. But insurance money? That's clean, immediate, and completely untraceable once it's been properly laundered. Linda was sobbing harder now. Derek said it would look like an accident, that Tommy wouldn't suffer, that we could use the money to start over somewhere beautiful, somewhere we could be happy. And you believed him? I loved him. Linda screamed. Do you understand that? I actually loved someone who loved me back. You never loved me, Bobby. You loved having me. You loved showing me off like another one of your possessions. But Derek saw me as a person. Bobby studied his wife's face, searching for any trace of the woman he'd married 20 years ago. When did you stop loving Tommy? The question seemed to hit Linda like a physical blow. I never stopped loving him. But Derek explained that Tommy would never really be happy anyway. He was too sensitive for this world, too gentle. Derek said it would be kinder to murder him for money, to let him go peacefully before life could break him the way it breaks everyone else. Linda's voice dropped to a whisper. Derek said Tommy would thank us if he could understand. Bobby turned to Derek. And what about the other families in Portland, Seattle, Phoenix? Did they thank you too? Derek's composure finally cracked completely. Those situations were business. Cold, clean business arrangements between consenting adults. This is different. Different how? Because I actually care about Linda. The others were just marks, just means to an end. But Linda and I have something real. Derek leaned forward as much as his restraints allowed. You want to know the truth, Hutchinson? Your wife came to me. She approached me, seduced me, convinced me to help her. I was just going to take the business money and move on, but she made me a better offer. Bobby looked at Linda, who was shaking her head frantically. That's not true. Derek, tell him that's not true. She'd been researching ways to kill Tommy for months before I ever suggested the insurance angle. Derek continued. She'd looked into accidental drowning, food poisoning, even hiring professionals. I just provided a cleaner method. Derek, stop. Linda was hyperventilating now. Please stop talking. But Derek was in full confessional mode, perhaps hoping to shift blame or buy himself mercy. She showed me Tommy's room, pointed out all the ways she could make it look like suicide. Said the insurance money would be cleaner than dealing with inheritance lawyers. Said Tommy was getting suspicious anyway, that he'd been asking questions about her business trips. Bobby felt something fundamental shift inside him. Linda hadn't been seduced by Derek. She'd been planning Tommy's murder independently and recruited Derek to help execute it. How long? Bobby asked quietly. How long what? How long had you been planning to kill our son? Linda looked up at him with tear-streaked mascara, and for just a moment, Bobby saw something that chilled him to the bone. Relief. Relief that she didn't have to pretend anymore. Since his 16th birthday, she whispered. When I realized the insurance policies I'd been building would mature when he turned 18. When I understood that he was going to college and wouldn't need me anymore, wouldn't be my baby anymore. When I calculated that $2 million could buy me freedom from this life, from this marriage, from being Bobby Hutchinson's trophy wife. The room fell silent, except for the hum of the warehouse's ventilation system. Bobby stared at the woman who'd shared his bed for 20 years, who'd held their newborn son, who'd posed for thousands of family photos with love and tenderness that had apparently been completely fake. You've been planning to murder Tommy for almost 2 years. I've been planning to set him free, Linda corrected, and to set myself free in the process. Bobby stood up slowly, his legs feeling unsteady. Behind him, Marcus cleared his throat. Boss, what are your instructions? Bobby looked down at Derek and Linda, two people who'd spent months planning to murder his son, who'd sabotaged Tommy's motorcycle and left him to die on a lonely country road, who'd been prepared to cash insurance checks while Bobby grieved over their child's grave. Give me some time to think, Bobby said finally. Keep them comfortable. Keep them fed. But don't let them communicate with anyone. Understood. As Bobby walked toward the door, Derek called after him. Hutchinson, you can't keep us here forever. Eventually, someone's going to come looking. Bobby paused at the threshold. Who's going to look for you, Derek? Your criminal associates who you were planning to double-cross? The police you've been running from for years? Or maybe Linda's friends from the country club will organize a search party. He turned back to face them both. Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to take some time to decide exactly how to handle this situation. In the meantime, you're going to stay here and think about what you've done. Think about Tommy lying in that hospital bed. Think about the fact that your greed and selfishness almost killed an innocent boy. And then what? Linda asked. Bobby's smile was colder than anything Derek had ever managed. Then you're going to pay for what you've done. Both of you. In ways that will make you wish you'd never been born. He walked out, leaving them alone with Marcus and the weight of their confession. Outside, Bobby breathed deeply, trying to clear his head. Tommy was improving. His son was going to survive, was going to have a chance at the life Derek and Linda had tried to steal from him. But justice was still pending. And Bobby Hutchinson had never been patient when it came to collecting debts. Chapter 5. The Trap Closes. 3 days later, Tommy opened his eyes. Bobby was dozing in the bedside chair when he heard the change in his son's breathing. Tommy's eyes were unfocused at first, struggling against the harsh hospital lighting, but they found Bobby's face and held. Dad! Tommy's voice was barely a whisper, his throat raw from the breathing tube that had been removed that morning. I'm here, son. Bobby gripped Tommy's hand, feeling tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed for 72 hours. I'm right here. My bike. There was something wrong with the brakes. I know. We'll talk about that later. Right now, you just need to rest and get better. Tommy's eyes darted around the room. Where's Mom? Bobby had dreaded this question. She's not here, Tommy. She won't be coming. Is she sick? Did something happen to her? Something happened, but not what you think. Bobby squeezed his son's hand gently. Tommy, I found your hiding place at the lake house. I found all the photos, all the research. Tommy's eyes widened, and Bobby could see the memories flooding back. Derek. He saw me taking pictures. He chased me, but I got away. I went home to warn Mom, but she wasn't there. I was going to wait for you, but I got scared and decided to ride to the police station instead. That's when the brakes failed. They were fine when I left the house. Perfect. I checked them myself that morning because the bike had been making weird noises. Tommy struggled to sit up. Dad, Derek did something to them. He tried to kill me. I know. And your mother knew too. The color drained from Tommy's face. What do you mean? Bobby had hoped to ease into this conversation, but Tommy deserved the truth. Your mother and Derek planned it together, son. They took out life insurance on you and arranged the accident to collect the money. Tommy stared at his father in disbelief. That's impossible. Mom loves me. She would never. I have their confessions, Tommy. Recorded confessions where they admitted everything. Bobby's voice was gentle but firm. Your mother has been planning this for almost 2 years. Tommy turned his face toward the wall, tears streaming down his cheeks. Bobby felt his heart break, watching his son process the ultimate betrayal. How do you explain to a 17-year-old that his mother wanted him dead for money? Where are they now? Tommy asked finally. Somewhere safe. Somewhere they can't hurt anyone else. Tommy looked back at his father, and Bobby saw something new in his son's eyes. Something harder than had been there before the accident. What are you going to do to them? Bobby studied his son's face carefully. Tommy had always been idealistic, believing in justice and forgiveness. But having your own mother try to murder you for insurance money had a way of changing a person's perspective on such things. What do you think I should do? I think, Tommy said slowly, that they tried to kill me for money. I think Mom stopped being my mother the moment she decided I was worth more dead than alive. And I think Derek is a predator who's probably done this before. He has. At least 3 other times in 3 other cities. Tommy nodded grimly. Then I think you should make sure they never get the chance to hurt anyone else ever again. Bobby felt a surge of dark pride. His son was going to be all right. Changed, hardened, but all right. The police are looking for them, Bobby said carefully. They think Derek and your mother fled town when they learned about the brake line investigation. But they didn't flee. No, they didn't. Tommy was quiet for a long time, staring at the ceiling. Dad, when I get out of here, I want to help. Whatever you're planning, I want to be part of it. Tommy, they try to kill me. My own mother tried to murder me for money. Tommy's voice was getting stronger, filled with a resolve Bobby had never heard before. I deserve to be part of whatever happens next. Bobby squeezed his son's hand. All right, but first you get better. Then we'll talk about justice. Over the next week, as Tommy's condition improved rapidly, Bobby finalized his plans. The warehouse had become a temporary prison, with Derek and Linda being held in separate rooms under Marcus's careful supervision. They were being fed, given medical attention, and kept comfortable, but they were also being slowly broken down through isolation and psychological pressure. Derek was cracking first, used to controlling situations through charm and manipulation. He was struggling with his complete powerlessness. He'd gone from demanding lawyers to offering information about his previous crimes in exchange for better treatment. Linda was holding up better, but Bobby knew her breaking point was coming. She'd always been dependent on others for her sense of identity. First on Bobby for financial security, then on Derek for emotional validation. Cut off from both sources, she was starting to unravel. But Bobby wasn't ready for them to break yet. He needed them functional for what came next. Boss, Marcus said as Bobby arrived at the warehouse on Friday morning. We've got a complication. What kind of complication? Linda's been asking about Tommy. Wants to know if he's alive, if he's going to recover. Derek's been telling her the kid's probably dead, that they succeeded even if they got caught. Bobby frowned, and she's starting to crack. Really crack. Last night she was screaming that she never wanted Tommy to die, that Derek forced her into it. This morning she's asking to write him a letter, begging to see him one more time. Buyer's remorse. Seems like it. Question is, do we want to let her think the kid's dead, or do we want her to know he survived? Bobby considered the options. Linda believing Tommy was dead would torment her with guilt. But Linda knowing Tommy was alive and improving would torment her with the knowledge that she'd failed to murder her own son and would face his judgment when this was over. Let her know he's alive. Let her know he's getting better every day. And let her know he's seen the evidence of what she tried to do. Marcus nodded. Copy that. What about Derek? Derek's a different problem. He's not going to break from guilt because he doesn't feel any. He's going to break from fear. Bobby smiled coldly. It's time to introduce him to some of his old associates. You found them. I found them. And they're very interested in having a conversation with Derek about some money that went missing in Phoenix. That afternoon, Bobby made a series of phone calls that would have impressed the FBI's organized crime unit. Within hours, 3 very unpleasant men were driving toward the warehouse in a black SUV with Arizona plates. Vincent, Vinny, Torino, and his associates had been looking for Derek Manning for 8 months. Derek had skipped town with $200,000 that belonged to some very serious people. Money that was supposed to fund Derek's next operation, but had instead been used to finance his move to Bobby's town. Vinny was the kind of man who collected debts with a crowbar and considered himself an artist in the field of creative interrogation. He and Derek had unfinished business that went well beyond money. As the sun set over the warehouse district, Bobby stood in the parking lot watching Vinny's SUV approach. Inside the warehouse, Derek Manning was about to learn that betraying Bobby Hutchinson was only the second worst mistake he'd made recently. The worst mistake had been thinking he could skip town without paying his debts to Vincent Torino. Bobby checked his watch. Tommy was being discharged from the hospital tomorrow morning. By then, Derek would understand exactly how serious his situation had become, and Linda would be ready for the conversation that would determine how the rest of her very short life would play out. Justice was coming, and Bobby Hutchinson was going to make sure it was thorough, complete, and absolutely final. Chapter 6, The Breaking Point. Bobby brought Tommy home from the hospital on a gray October morning that felt like the end of something. His son moved carefully, still healing from his injuries, but there was a new hardness in his eyes that made him look older than his 17 years. How long have they been here? Tommy asked as Bobby pulled through the estate gates. 6 days. And they don't know I'm alive? They know now. I made sure Linda found out yesterday. Tommy nodded grimly. The boy who'd left for his motorcycle ride a week ago had believed in fairness, justice, and his mother's love. The young man sitting beside Bobby now understood that some betrayals couldn't be forgiven and some people didn't deserve second chances. They spent the afternoon going through Tommy's evidence together, with Bobby explaining how each piece fit into the larger picture. Tommy absorbed it all with clinical detachment, asking questions about Derek's previous crimes and Linda's financial motivations with the same tone he might use to discuss a school assignment. "When do I get to see them?" Tommy asked as they finished reviewing the insurance documents. "Tonight. But first, there's something you need to understand about what's been happening at the warehouse." Bobby explained about Vincent Torino and his associates, about Derek's mounting terror as his past caught up with him, about Linda's psychological deterioration as she faced the reality of what she'd done. "Derek's been telling Linda that you're dead," Bobby continued, "that even though they got caught, they succeeded in killing you. When she finds out you're alive and here, it's going to destroy whatever's left of her sanity." Tommy considered this. Good. She deserves to be destroyed. At 8 p.m., Bobby and Tommy drove to the warehouse. Marcus met them at the entrance, his expression grim. "Derek's in bad shape," Marcus reported. "Vinny's boys worked him over pretty good this afternoon. Nothing permanent, but he's scared out his mind. Linda's worse. She's been talking to herself, asking God to forgive her, begging for Tommy to haunt her dreams." "Let's start with Derek," Bobby decided. They found Derek Manning zip-tied to a metal chair in room 2, his face a patchwork of bruises and his expensive clothes torn. When he saw Bobby enter, followed by Tommy, Derek's eyes went wide with shock and terror. "No," Derek whispered. "You're supposed to be dead. The brakes failed. You crashed." Tommy limped closer, his face expressionless. "I survived. Sorry to disappoint you. This is impossible. The bike was totaled, the tree. You didn't cut the brake lines deep enough," Tommy said calmly. "They failed on a straight stretch instead of a curve. I managed to lay the bike down instead of hitting the tree head-on." Derek stared at Tommy as if seeing a ghost. "But Vinny said," Linda's been believing what you told her," Bobby interjected. "That you'd succeeded in murdering my son. Imagine how she's going to feel when she finds out you failed." Derek began hyperventilating. It was one thing to face Bobby's wrath or even Vinny Torino's violent debt collection, but having his victim alive, standing in front of him, making it impossible to maintain any psychological distance from his crime, that was breaking him. "I want you to understand something," Tommy said, his voice carrying an eerie calm. "I spent 3 days in a coma because you and my mother decided I was worth more dead than alive. 3 days where the doctors weren't sure I'd ever wake up." Derek was shaking now. "Tommy, you have to understand, it wasn't personal. It was just business, just business." Tommy's voice finally carried some emotion, cold fury. "You tried to murder me for insurance money. You convinced my mother to betray her own son. You destroyed my family for $2 million. Your mother approached me. She's the one who wanted you dead." The slap came so fast Derek didn't see it coming. Tommy's hand connected with Derek's injured face, sending fresh blood spattering across the concrete floor. "Don't you ever talk about my mother that way," Tommy said quietly. "Yes, she betrayed me. Yes, she wanted me dead. But you're the predator who made it possible. You're the one who showed her how to turn murder into profit." Bobby watched his son with a mixture of pride and concern. Tommy was handling this better than expected, but there was something different about him now. Something that worried Bobby, even as it impressed him. "What do you want from me?" Derek asked through swollen lips. "I want you to understand what you've cost me," Tommy replied. "My mother's love, my trust in family, my belief that people are fundamentally good. You took all of that away when you decided to use me as a payday." Tommy turned to Bobby. "I'm ready to see her now." Linda was in room 3, pacing frantically in the small space. When the door opened and she saw Tommy walking in behind Bobby, she collapsed her knees. "Tommy," she screamed. "Oh God, Tommy, you're alive." She tried to rush toward him, but her zip-tied hands threw off her balance, and she fell forward. Tommy made no move to help her up. "Hello, Mother." Linda struggled to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "Baby, are you okay? Are you hurt? They told me you were dead. They said the accident." "The accident you planned," Tommy said quietly. The murder you arranged with Derek. Linda's face crumpled. No, baby, no. You don't understand. Derek said it would be quick, that you wouldn't suffer. He promised me you wouldn't feel any pain. I felt plenty of pain, Mother. Physical pain when the bike crashed. Emotional pain when I realized my own mother wanted me dead. And the pain I'm feeling right now, looking at you and remembering all the times you hugged me and told me you loved me while planning to murder me for money. I do love you, Linda sobbed. I've always loved you. But Derek explained that you'd never really be happy, that the world would break you eventually, that it would be kinder to murder me for $2 million. Linda stared at her son, seeing the change in him, the hardness that hadn't been there before. What have I done? She whispered. Oh God, what have I done to you? You tried to murder me, Tommy said simply. You spent 2 years planning to kill your own son for insurance money. You recruited a criminal to help you. You sabotaged my motorcycle and left me to die on a country road. I never wanted you to suffer, but you wanted me dead. Linda couldn't answer. The truth was too ugly to voice, too horrible to acknowledge. Tommy turned to Bobby. I'm done here. I've seen enough. As they walked toward the door, Linda called after them desperately. Tommy, please, give me a chance to explain. Give me a chance to make this right. Tommy paused at the threshold. There's nothing to explain, Mother, and there's no way to make this right. You chose money over your son's life. Now you get to live with the consequences of that choice. What consequences? Linda asked, terror creeping into her voice. Tommy looked back at her with eyes that seemed far older than 17. You'll find out. Outside the room, Bobby put his hand on Tommy's shoulder. You did well in there. I don't feel good about it, Tommy admitted. I feel empty, like something inside me died in that hospital room and isn't coming back. That's normal, son. Some betrayals change you permanently. Tommy nodded. What happens now? Bobby checked his watch. Now we let them think about what they've learned. Tomorrow, we start the final phase, which is... Bobby's smile was colder than anything Derek Manning had ever managed. Justice. Complete, final, and absolutely permanent. As they drove away from the warehouse, Tommy stared out at the darkness. Dad, when this is over, I want to leave town. Go to college somewhere far away. Start over where nobody knows what happened. We'll make that happen, Bobby promised. But first, we finish what Derek and your mother started. Tommy nodded. The boy who believed in fairness and second chances was gone forever. In his place sat a young man who understood that some people didn't deserve mercy, some crimes couldn't be forgiven, and some debts could only be paid in blood. Derek and Linda had created their own monster when they tried to murder Bobby Hutchinson's son. Now, they were going to meet him face to face. Chapter 7, Justice Served. The next evening, Bobby gathered everyone at the warehouse for what he privately called the final performance. Vinnie Torino and his associates were present, having been promised that Derek would soon be available for permanent debt collection. Marcus and his crew stood by, ready to handle whatever cleanup would be necessary. But the stars of this particular show were Derek and Linda, both of whom had been moved to the main floor and secured to chairs facing each other. For the first time since their capture, they could see each other's condition, Derek's battered face and Linda's hollow-eyed desperation. Tommy sat in a third chair, positioned between them like a judge. He'd insisted on being present for this, and Bobby had agreed. His son deserved to see justice done. Before we begin, Bobby announced, I want both of you to understand exactly where we are in this process. Derek, Vinnie Torino has legal claim to your life. You stole his money, skipped town, and left him holding the bag for a deal that went bad. Normally, I just hand you over and walk away. Derek's eyes darted toward Vinnie, who smiled back with the warmth of a shark scenting blood. But this isn't just about money, Bobby continued. This is about justice for my son and consequences for both of you. He pulled out a thick folder and set it on a table where both of them could see it. This contains complete documentation of your crimes. Derek's previous fraud operations in 3 cities. Linda's financial planning for Tommy's murder. Your communications about the insurance policy. Your meeting with the men who helped sabotage Tommy's motorcycle. Linda went pale. What communications? We were careful. You were careful about phone calls. But Derek kept souvenirs. Bobby pulled out a series of printed emails. love letters detailing your plans, financial projections showing how you'd split the insurance money, even a timeline for Tommy's murder that Derek titled Project Freedom. Derek stared at the emails in horror. Those were private. You had no right. I had every right to investigate my son's attempted murder, Bobby snapped. Just like the FBI will have every right to use these as evidence when they find your bodies. The word bodies hung in the air like a death sentence. Linda began crying again, but Derek straightened up with desperate defiance. You can't murder us in cold blood, Hutchinson. You're not that kind of man. You're right, Bobby agreed. I'm not going to murder you in cold blood. Relief flickered across Derek's face, quickly replaced by confusion as Bobby continued. I'm going to give you the same chance you gave my son. I'm going to arrange an accident. Bobby nodded to Marcus, who wheeled in a large metal tank connected to various tubes and gauges. Propane, Bobby explained conversationally. Highly flammable, but also heavier than air. When it leaks, it settles in low places and builds up until something ignites it. Gas explosion, Vinny said approvingly. Classic industrial accident. Happens all the time in places like this. The beauty is that the explosion will destroy most evidence of what happened here, Bobby continued. Your bodies will be found in the wreckage, but the cause of death will be listed as accidental. Just like Tommy's accident was supposed to look. Linda was hyperventilating now. Bobby, please. I know I made mistakes, but you can't do this. I'm your wife. You stopped being my wife when you decided to murder our son. Bobby's voice was ice cold. You became a stranger who tried to destroy my family for money. Tommy spoke for the first time. How long do we have before the explosion? Bobby checked his watch. The timer's set for 15 minutes. Enough time for final words, but not enough for any miraculous escapes. Derek tested his restraints frantically. This is insane. You're going to kill us for money that was never even real. The money was real enough for you to cut brake lines, Tommy replied calmly. Real enough for you to plan my murder. But I didn't go through with it. Only because you got caught. Tommy leaned forward slightly. Derek, if I hadn't discovered your meetings, if I hadn't found the insurance policy, if I hadn't started taking pictures, you would have murdered me and moved on to the next town. Derek couldn't deny it. The truth was written all over his face. Linda tried a different approach. Tommy, baby, I know you're angry, but you're better than this. You don't want to become a killer. Don't let your father turn you into something you'll regret. Tommy stared at his mother with eyes that held no warmth, no recognition, no love. You're right, Mother. I don't want to become a killer. That's why I'm not going to pull any triggers or light any fuses. Then stop this. I'm not stopping anything. I'm just watching justice happen to people who try to murder me for money. Tommy's voice carried a finality that chilled everyone in the room. You made your choices. Now live with the consequences. Bobby felt a complex mix of emotions watching his son. Tommy had been irreversibly changed by this experience, hardened in ways that would probably affect him for the rest of his life. But he was also displaying a strength and moral clarity that Bobby found impressive. 5 minutes, Marcus announced. Derek was pulling against his restraints hard enough to draw blood. Hutchinson, you win, okay? We'll confess everything. We'll plead guilty. We'll take whatever sentence the courts give us. The courts? Bobby laughed harshly. Derek, you're wanted in 3 states for fraud and murder. Vinny here has a contract on your life. And my son has permanent brain damage from the accident you caused. Do you really think the courts are going to provide adequate justice? Your son looks fine to me. Tommy touched the scar on his forehead where surgeons had relieved pressure on his brain. The doctors say I'll have seizures for the rest of my life. Possible memory problems. Coordination issues. All because you wanted insurance money. 2 minutes, Marcus called. Linda was praying now, begging God for forgiveness, promising to change if she survived. Derek had given up on his restraints and was offering Bobby everything he could think of: money, information about other criminals, sexual favors from Linda, anything to buy more time. Bobby watched them both with detached interest. In a few minutes, the people who tried to murder his son would be dead, and justice would be served. But he felt no satisfaction, no sense of completion. just cold efficiency and the knowledge that a necessary job was being finished. 30 seconds, Marcus announced. Tommy, Linda screamed. Please, I'm your mother. I gave birth to you. I raised you. That has to count for something. Tommy looked at her one final time. You stopped being my mother when you decided I was worth more dead than alive. Now you're just a stranger who tried to murder me for money. 10 seconds, Marcus called. Derek was cursing now, screaming threats about what his associates would do to Bobby's family. Linda was praying and crying and begging. Neither of them looked like the confident conspirators who'd planned Tommy's murder. They looked like what they'd always been, selfish, weak people who'd been willing to murder a child for money. Time, Marcus announced. But instead of an explosion, the warehouse filled with the sound of police sirens. Bobby smiled as Detective Morrison and a dozen officers poured through the doors, weapons drawn. Gentlemen, you're just in time. Derek and Linda stared in shock as their restraints were cut, and they were immediately resecured with handcuffs. Morrison looked around the warehouse, taking in the propane tank, which Bobby had never actually armed, the recording equipment, and the pile of evidence. Everything's been recorded? Morrison asked. Every word, Bobby confirmed, handing over multiple digital devices. Confessions to Tommy's attempted murder, details about Derek's previous crimes, financial records showing the insurance fraud. Everything you need for airtight convictions. Tommy stood up slowly, favoring his injured leg. They actually believed you were going to kill them with a gas explosion? People facing death will believe anything, Bobby replied. Even people who were planning to murder children for money. As Derek and Linda were led away in handcuffs, Derek managed one final outburst. You can't prove anything. Those confessions were coerced. Detective Morrison smiled grimly. Confessions given under duress to prevent imminent death? Yeah, those hold up in court just fine. Especially when they're corroborated by physical evidence, financial records, and witness testimony. Linda said nothing as she was loaded into a police van. She just stared at Tommy with hollow eyes, perhaps finally understanding that she destroyed not just her son's trust, but her own life as well. What happens now? Tommy asked as the police cars disappeared into the darkness. Now they go to prison for the rest of their lives, Bobby replied. Derek's looking at charges in 4 states, plus whatever Vinny's friends decide to do to him in prison. Linda's looking at conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and accessory to attempted murder. Tommy nodded. And us? We rebuild. We move forward. We make sure this never happens again. As they walked toward Bobby's truck, Tommy asked the question that had been haunting him. Dad, are you proud of who I've become through this? Bobby stopped and looked at his son, really looked at him. Tommy had been forced to grow up in the worst possible way, had learned that evil could wear a loving face, had discovered that some betrayals were unforgivable. But he'd also shown strength, wisdom, and a moral clarity that impressed Bobby. I'm proud that you survived, Bobby said finally. I'm proud that you fought back. And I'm proud that when you had the chance for revenge, you chose justice instead. Tommy smiled for the first time in weeks. I learned from the best. As they drove away from the warehouse, Bobby reflected on everything that had happened. Derek and Linda would spend the rest of their lives paying for their crimes. Tommy would carry scars from this experience forever, but he'd also proven he was strong enough to survive anything. And Bobby had learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is ensuring that those who threaten your family never get the chance to threaten anyone else. Justice had been served. The family had been protected. And Bobby Hutchinson's reputation for never forgetting those who crossed him had been reinforced once again. Some debts could only be paid in full. Chapter 8, The Aftermath. 6 months later, Tommy graduated from high school as valedictorian, his acceptance letter to MIT tucked safely in his desk drawer. The seizures had been mild and manageable. The coordination issues had resolved with physical therapy, and the memory problems had turned out to be a blessing. He could forget the sound of his mother's voice confessing to planning his murder. Derek Manning had been sentenced to life without parole after pleading guilty to attempted murder, fraud, and racketeering charges in 4 states. 3 weeks into his sentence at a maximum security facility in Arizona, he'd been found dead in his cell. The official cause was suicide, but Vinnie Torino's associates had been known to be creative in their debt collection methods. Linda Hutchinson had been sentenced to 25 years for conspiracy to commit murder and insurance fraud. She'd aged a decade in the 6 months since her arrest. Her perfect blonde hair now gray at the roots, her designer wardrobe replaced with prison orange. She'd written letters to Tommy begging for forgiveness, but he'd returned them unopened. Bobby stood in the empty master bedroom, packing the last of Linda's belongings into boxes marked for donation. He'd already removed her photos from the walls, cleared her cosmetics from the bathroom, and sorted through 20 years of accumulated marriage. Most of it was going to charity. He wanted nothing in his house that reminded him of the woman who'd tried to murder his son. "Dad!" Tommy appeared in the doorway. "The real estate agent is here." Bobby nodded. They were selling the estate and moving to Boston, where Tommy would attend MIT and Bobby would establish the East Coast office of Hutchinson Construction he'd been considering for years. Fresh start, new city, no memories of brake lines and insurance policies. The real estate agent was a efficient woman in her 40s who'd been appropriately sympathetic about Bobby's tragic divorce without asking uncomfortable questions. She walked through the house taking notes, commenting on the custom craftsmanship and premium finishes that would make it attractive to upscale buyers. "The only challenge will be the recent notoriety," she admitted as they finished the tour. The Linda Hutchinson case was all over the news. Some buyers might be put off by the association. "Lower the price accordingly," Bobby said. "I want it sold quickly." As the agent left, Bobby found Tommy in his room, packing books and photography equipment. The boy had grown 3 inches since the accident, filling out with muscle from months of physical therapy. At 18, he looked more like Bobby than ever. Same hard jaw, same calculating eyes, same ability to remain calm under pressure. "Any regrets about leaving?" Bobby asked. Tommy looked around his childhood bedroom, taking in the trophies and photos and memories of a more innocent time. "None at all. This place is contaminated now." Strong word. Accurate word. Tommy sealed another box. "Every room in this house has memories of her. Her reading me bedtime stories while planning my murder. Her making breakfast while calculating insurance payouts. Her hugging me goodbye while knowing she'd arranged for me never to come home." Bobby understood. He'd had the same thoughts walking through rooms where Linda had smiled and laughed and played the role of loving wife and mother while secretly planning to destroy their family. "MIT will be good for you," Bobby said. "New environment, intellectual challenges, people who don't know your history. What about you? Will you be okay starting over at 45? Bobby smiled. "Son, I started over with nothing at 25. At 45, I've got experience, capital, and connections. Plus, I'll have the satisfaction of knowing the people who tried to destroy us are exactly where they belong." They finished packing in comfortable silence, 2 survivors preparing to move beyond the wreckage of betrayal. As the sun set over the estate Bobby had built with his own hands, he felt no nostalgia for what he was leaving behind. This house had been built on love and trust that had turned out to be illusions. The new house in Boston would be built on truth and the unbreakable bond between a father and son who'd survive the ultimate test together. "Dad," Tommy said as they loaded the last boxes into the truck, "I want you to know that what happened didn't just take away my mother. It gave me something too." "What's that?" "Certainty. About who you are, about what matters, about how far you'll go to protect the people you love." Tommy looked directly at Bobby. "I never have to wonder if you'd betray me for money or convenience or personal gain. I know you wouldn't." Bobby felt his throat tighten. "You never had to wonder about that, son. I know that now. But before this happened, it was just faith. Now it's knowledge based on evidence." Tommy smiled grimly. "She tried to destroy our family, but she ended up proving that the part of our family that matters is unbreakable." As they drove away from the estate, Bobby thought about the journey that had brought them to this point. Linda and Derek had thought they were targeting easy victims, a successful businessman distracted by his work and a naive teenager who wouldn't see danger coming. They'd been wrong on both counts. Bobby Hutchinson had built his empire by being smarter and more ruthless than everyone else. Tommy Hutchinson had inherited his father's intelligence and strength, along with his mother's beauty and charm. but none of her weakness or selfishness. Derek and Linda had thought they were destroying a family. Instead, they forged it into something stronger than steel. In Boston, Bobby would build an even more successful company. Tommy would earn his engineering degree and probably surpass his father's achievements. They would both find new relationships, new challenges, new sources of happiness. But they would never again be vulnerable to the kind of betrayal that had nearly destroyed them. They'd learned that some people couldn't be trusted, some relationships were built on lies, and some enemies needed to be eliminated permanently. Most importantly, they'd learned that blood meant nothing compared to loyalty, that family was defined by actions rather than genetics, and that the strongest bonds were forged in the fire of shared survival. Linda Hutchinson had given birth to Tommy, but she'd lost the right to call herself his mother when she'd chosen money over his life. Bobby Hutchinson had earned his son's loyalty and respect by proving he'd never make that choice. As they crossed the state line, leaving behind everything associated with their former life, Bobby felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with justice. Derek and Linda had received exactly what they deserved. Tommy had survived and grown stronger. Bobby had protected his family and eliminated the threats against them. The games were over. The war had been won, and the Hutchinson name would continue with honor in a new city, free from the contamination of betrayal and strengthened by the knowledge that they'd survived the worst that life could throw at them. Some battles ended with negotiated settlements. Others ended with total victory and the complete destruction of your enemies. This had been the second kind. Chapter 9, New Beginnings. 2 years later, Bobby stood on the roof of a half-finished skyscraper in downtown Boston, surveying the city that had become their new home. Hutchinson Construction East Coast had exceeded every projection, with contracts worth $50 million and a reputation for quality that had established them as the premier builder in the region. Tommy was in his sophomore year at MIT, studying engineering with a focus on structural design. He'd made Dean's List both semesters, joined the boxing team to work through his remaining anger, and started dating a brilliant chemistry student named Rachel who knew nothing about his past and didn't need to. Mr. Hutchinson, Bobby's new assistant, Janet, approached carefully. She'd learned that interrupting him during his rooftop thinking time required good reason. "You have a call from Detective Morrison." Bobby frowned. Morrison had kept in touch sporadically, updating them on legal developments, but it had been months since their last contact. He followed Janet to the construction trailer that served as their temporary office. "Morrison? What's the news?" "Bobby, I wanted to give you a heads up. Linda's been granted a medical compassionate release hearing. Her lawyers are claiming she's developed a severe psychiatric condition that requires specialized treatment." Bobby's jaw tightened. Meaning they want to transfer her to a minimum security psychiatric facility instead of prison. She'd still be confined, but the conditions would be much more comfortable. "What are her chances?" "Better than I'd like. She's been a model prisoner, no incidents, and the psychiatric evaluations support her claims of severe depression and anxiety. The judge might go for it." Bobby was quiet for a long moment. "When's the hearing?" "Next Tuesday. You and Tommy have the right to provide victim impact statements if you want to attend." After hanging up, Bobby stared out at the Boston skyline. Linda was trying to game the system one more time, looking for an easier way to serve her sentence. Even in prison, she was still scheming, still manipulating, still trying to avoid the full consequences of her actions. He called Tommy at MIT. His son listened without comment as Bobby explained the situation. "Do you want to go to the hearing?" Bobby asked. "Absolutely. She needs to understand that her victims are watching, that her crimes have permanent consequences." "Tommy, you don't have to put yourself through that." "Seeing her again. Dad, I need to see her. I need to look at the person who tried to murder me and make sure she understands that I survived everything she tried to do to me." The following Tuesday, Bobby and Tommy sat in a courtroom in Linda's current state, watching as his former wife was led in wearing shackles and a gray prison uniform. She'd lost 30 pounds and looked fragile, vulnerable, exactly the image her lawyers wanted to project. Linda's eyes found Bobby and Tommy in the gallery, and for a moment, her carefully constructed facade cracked. She'd probably hoped they wouldn't attend, that she could play the role of reformed victim without having to face the son she'd tried to murder. The psychiatric expert testified about Linda's deteriorating mental health, her remorse over her crimes, her potential for rehabilitation in a treatment facility. Linda herself took the stand, crying as she described her guilt and depression, her desperate desire to make amends for her terrible mistakes. She was good, Bobby admitted grudgingly. Convincing, sympathetic, genuinely fragile. If he hadn't known the truth about her, he might have believed the performance. When the prosecutor called Tommy to give his victim impact statement, the courtroom fell silent. At 20, Tommy had grown into a confident young man who commanded attention when he spoke. "Your Honor," Tommy began, "the defendant is my biological mother. She raised me, claimed to love me, and spent 2 years planning to murder me for insurance money." Linda flinched as if struck. She recruited a career criminal to help her. She researched methods of making my death look accidental. She took out a $2 million life insurance policy and calculated how to split the proceeds with her accomplice. Tommy's voice remained calm, factual, devastating. "When I discovered evidence of their plan, the defendant and her accomplice attempted to murder me by sabotaging my motorcycle. I spent 3 days in a coma. I suffered permanent brain damage. I will have seizures for the rest of my life." The judge was listening intently, taking notes. "But the physical damage isn't the worst part," Tommy continued. "The worst part is learning that the woman who raised me, who I trusted completely, had been planning my death for 2 years. The worst part is knowing that every time she hugged me, every time she said she loved me, she was calculating how much money my death would be worth." Linda was crying harder now, but Tommy showed no sympathy. The defendant wants to serve her sentence in a comfortable psychiatric facility instead of prison. She wants sympathy for the depression and anxiety caused by being held accountable for trying to murder her own son. Tommy paused, letting that sink in. "Your Honor, I respectfully submit that the defendant's mental health problems are a direct result of her guilt over her crimes, not a reason to reduce her punishment. She chose to conspire to murder me. She chose to betray her family. She chose to value money over her son's life." Tommy looked directly at Linda. She made those choices when she was mentally competent and fully aware of the consequences. The fact that she now regrets those choices, the fact that living with the guilt is difficult for her, doesn't entitle her to a more comfortable prison cell. The courtroom was absolutely silent. "I survived my mother's attempt to murder me. I rebuilt my life despite the permanent damage she caused. I've thrived in college and started building a career. I've proven that her efforts to destroy me failed completely." Tommy's voice hardened. "Now I want to see her serve every day of the sentence she earned, in the prison she was assigned to, under the conditions that reflect the severity of her crimes, without special accommodations for the mental anguish caused by her guilt." Tommy returned to his seat without looking at Linda again. Bobby felt a surge of pride watching his son. The boy had become a man who understood that some people didn't deserve mercy, some crimes couldn't be mitigated by regret, and some consequences had to be faced in full. The judge deliberated for 30 minutes before denying Linda's request for transfer. She would serve her full sentence in maximum security, without the comfortable accommodations her lawyers had sought. As Linda was led away, she tried to catch Tommy's eye one more time. But Tommy was looking at his phone, checking messages from Rachel about their plans for the evening. Linda had become irrelevant to his life, a problem that had been solved and filed away. Outside the courthouse, Bobby and Tommy walked toward their rental car. "How do you feel?" Bobby asked. "Satisfied. She got exactly what she deserved. No more, no less." Tommy smiled. "And I got to see that she's exactly where she belongs." "Any regrets about coming?" "None. I needed to see her powerless, to confirm that she can't hurt us anymore." Tommy got into the passenger seat. "She's going to spend the next 23 years in a small cell, thinking about what she lost when she chose money over family." As they drove toward the airport, Bobby reflected on how completely their roles had reversed. 2 years ago, he'd been the one consumed by rage and planning revenge. Now Tommy was the one with ice in his veins, calmly ensuring that justice was served. Linda had created her own nemesis when she tried to murder her son. Tommy would never forgive her, never show her mercy, never allow her to escape the full consequences of her betrayal. He would spend the rest of his life succeeding, thriving, and proving that her attempt to destroy him had failed completely. "Dad," Tommy said as their plane lifted off. "Thank you." "For what?" "For showing me that family isn't about blood. It's about loyalty. It's about people who would never betray you, no matter what." Bobby squeezed his son's shoulder. "We're all the family we need." "I know, and that's why we're going to win at everything we do for the rest of our lives." As Boston disappeared below them, Bobby thought about the future. Tommy would graduate from MIT with honors, probably start his own company, definitely surpass every achievement Bobby had managed. He'd marry Rachel or someone like her, have children who would grow up knowing that family meant unbreakable loyalty. Bobby would continue building his empire, secure in the knowledge that his son was strong enough to handle anything life threw at him. They would both find new sources of happiness, new challenges to conquer, new ways to prove that the people who tried to destroy them had only made them stronger. Linda would spend the next 2 decades in a cell, thinking about the family she'd betrayed and the life she'd thrown away for money.